Lauren Quayle-Sill from Hutchinson.
Emmerich Cross from Kansas City.
Troy, you need to unmute.
I'm Warren Gefeller from Russell.
I think Troy, I heard it. I could read his lips.
There you go. Hi, Troy Spohr from Oakley.
And I think Gary is on the phone, but he'll be with us shortly here. Staff?
You're not unmuted, Sheila.
Nope. Sheila Camus, admin support in Pratt. Brad, you're still muted. Chris, you're still muted.
All right, thank you. This is Brad Lovis. I'm secretary. I'm reporting from Pratt today.
Mike Miller, assistant secretary from Pratt as well.
Chris Tymason, legal counsel.
Okay. Is there any additions or deletions to the agenda item, Sheila?
No changes.
Okay. You'll note that we have mostly general discussion and workshop, so there will be some general discussion and workshop in the evening session. This particular meeting, there won't be any public hearing. So let's move on to the minutes. Are there any additions or are there any corrections to the minutes? If there are none, I'd like a motion that they be approved.
I so move.
I'll
This is
second.
Lauren Sill.
And Commissioner Gefeller, second.
It's been moved and seconded, and that's a good point. Lauren and Warren, we need to, starting with myself, identify ourselves when we talk, whenever we can remember to do so. It makes it easier for both the minutes and for the public record. So this is Commissioner Lauer. I'd like to have, it's been moved and seconded. If there is no discussion, all in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. I'm going to move now to general public comment on non-agenda items. We encourage people to speak up on items that are not on the agenda. I think we have 2 or 3 items that we're going to use this time to have staff make a couple of comments. But first, is there any public comment? Anybody from the public who would like to address the group?
Margaret, you're still muted.
There's some people in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Right. There was, I just received one from Nicholas. Is it Beam? Boom. Is he there?
Margaret Kramer is trying to talk too, but I think she's muted.
I've unmuted Nicholas to go.
All right, we'll get you with Margaret in a moment then. Okay, Nicholas, speak. Nick?
Okay, speaking now. Sorry, I'm used to muting myself in work meetings. So my name is Nicholas Boehm. I'm from the Kansas City area and just have a brief statement with regard to waterfowl hunting. First, I want to express my gratitude for the wildlife area managers and their staff for all the hard work they do for both ducks and duck hunters. It does not go unnoticed. And without public lands, I think a lot of us wouldn't have the opportunities that we have to spend time outside. And I also really appreciate these Zoom meetings. It's a lot easier for folks who are, working 40-hour weeks than traveling across the state. So to that topic at hand. So this year in particular, myself and friends who hunt public lands for waterfowl across the state have noticed a great increase of hunting pressure on public areas. A lot of it coming from out-of-state hunters based on, of course, anecdotally, but license plates and just conversations about ramps. So I feel at least the volume of hunters, especially those non-residents during the week, has reduced the hunting quality substantially. And I've hunted a lot of these areas for years and often during the same exact time periods traveling around the state. And so it's definitely been frustrating to see what feels like 2 or 3 times the amount of people in marshes. So I feel pretty strongly that the core problem behind that is a lack of access. And I imagine that this is discussed many times over by the agency, but I just want to state my support for increasing the cost of the state waterfowl stamp, both for residents to at least $20, as well as doing something along the lines of implementing some kind of new non-resident waterfowl stamp or permit that is at least $50, and making sure those funds specifically go towards permanent waterfowl habitat acquisition. I know, I travel out of state to duck hunt, and I know that no matter what, if I have a place to go, I'm going, and I don't think that an increase in fees would deter a lot of the folks who are traveling here from places as far as South Carolina, Louisiana, et cetera. So I would love to see that happen and see that money go back into waterfowl habitat acquisition for everybody to enjoy. I don't necessarily feel that we need to restrict non-resident hunters. Like I said, I like to travel out of state, and I appreciate the opportunity to do that. And I think it's, this is everyone's resource, but I do feel that we need to help manage pressure on our public wildlife areas. So the other point I wanted to make is that the guides that operate throughout Kansas, I have observed them, for example, watch birds on public refuges, follow them out to fields where they're feeding, and then try and get permission or pay for those fields, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I'm all for running a business, and I would like to go on a sea duck or a snow goose hunt someday, and I will hire a guide when I do that. So this is not necessarily something where I'm angry with guides per se, but I do feel that the impact on the resource that a guide has is not necessarily equitable to the take, so to speak. Hobby hunters, for example, people who can get out a couple days a week, maybe take 2 or 3 of their buddies or family members, is a very different world than people who are running 12 hunters every day from October all the way through March. And I would just like to see those guides be licensed in such a way that it's revenue positive for the state, so that we can, again, increase access for kind of the common man. And to finish, I want to express my support for keeping the current seasons and zones pretty much how they are. I love being able to hunt early ducks all the way from October through January, but I would love to see at least part of the Kansas River be moved into the southeast zone, or just the boundaries adjusted, because we do see ducks sometimes stack up on the Kansas River right about now in January when it's cold. So that's all, and thank you for your time.
All right, thank you. Well, depending upon how many other public comment items we have, I may have some of these. I think Mike Miller and maybe Stuart Schrag can address some of these concerns, because this is one of many I've got many emails regarding this type of thing. But I think right now, Margaret Kramer is next to speak. Are you there, Margaret?
Yes. Let's see if I don't have her on the list anymore. It doesn't look like. Let's go ahead and go to Karen.
All right.
Karen, you should be unmuted now. Or
Okay,
it's asking
okay.
you to unmute.
All right. Yeah, I see that. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Karen Pagel Miners. I'm live in Lawrence right now, but I'm a farm kid. So I grew up in the country and like a real farm, a real working farm. So as a real farm kid, I know how to handle a rifle, but I don't hunt. I'm calling in today to express my opposition to the new rule of allowing night killing of coyotes using thermal imaging gear. I urge you to reconsider this decision. I'm still in the process of reading up and studying this issue, and I will send a follow-up email. But at this point, I can see no benefits whatsoever. And there are so many safety issues that this seems truly unnecessary and ill-advised. Again, I strongly urge you to reconsider this decision.
Okay. Is Margaret back?
Doesn't look like it at this point, but we also have a Brian Bailey. I'll unmute you, Brian.
All right.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Commissioners, my name is Brian Bailey and I live here in Leavenworth, Kansas. And I come with a problem, a safety, more or less a safety concern with some resolutions to that. On December 2nd, when deer season opened up, I was hunting at Perry Lake on the marshes, duck hunting. And we followed a group of guys in and we told them where we were hunting, and they went on in and they were deer hunting. And we had stuck an orange hat up on some tall weeds and in a tree in the location to where we were sitting on the marsh. And we had also told the deer hunters where we were on the marsh. Some time goes by, we are shooting some ducks and enjoying ourselves. And we sit back down, and next thing we know, we have a bullet zinging by our heads. And it wasn't but 2 seconds later, 3 seconds later, we have another bullet zinging by our heads in our location. And this one basically hit the ground behind us. No pun intended, but when you're duck hunting, you're sitting ducks. You're out on open water. You have nothing to hide behind. These gentlemen were pushing deer, and you know as well as I know is when you push deer, they run out, and you shoot the deer mainly on the run. When you are deer hunting in a stand or sitting on the ground, you have time to sit, observe your shooting lanes, and see what is out in front of you. Now, one of the first things you learn in hunter safety is don't pull the trigger unless you know exactly where that bullet's going. And with pushing deer, you do not know this. In that meantime of our situation, we had contacted the law enforcement for that area. And Mr. Page came and checked the situation out for us, and his staff was very helpful on helping us get our gear back out of there because we didn't know if the deer hunters were still in there and still possibly shooting at us or what was going on. So I come to you with some resolutions as well because that incident really scared me and my buddy that we were hunting with. And on public ground, you don't know what other hunters are in there hunting with you. With shotguns, shotgun pellets do not go, let's say, more than 100 yards at best, and by that time they've really slowed down on the velocity. A rifle bullet, on the other hand, it can go for a mile or better. So I'd like to ask for you guys' consideration on limiting or no pushing deer on public ground while you have other seasons going on. For that sake, I could see allowing deer hunters to be in there on public ground while other seasons are going on because they can sit in a stand and shoot a deer and see their lanes on where they're shooting. But when you're pushing deer, your environment is always changing, and unfortunately, a lot of people come out of the bigger cities and don't know their surroundings as well. When you're out on a farm and farmers are pushing their own private ground, you know where your objects are and the land around you, whereas on public ground, you may not know that. So that's one thing to consider. The other one is maybe closing the other seasons during deer season. I would hate for that to happen because I'm an avid upland hunter as well as duck hunter. But for safety concerns, I think it's an option to consider. Another option is maybe not to overlap the seasons, spread the seasons out a little bit. Now that's hard to do when you have deers in a rut and you also have ducks migrating down. So that's kind of a hard one to do. And then maybe another idea was to designated only duck hunt areas. You know, the marshes there around Lake Perry, you know, they're for a lot of different hunting activities, but mainly there's a lot of duck hunting that's done out of there. There also can be a lot of deer hunting. So I just wanted to bring those ideas to you guys, and maybe you can consider those options going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You have a point. I'm not sure how to resolve it, but we'll get thought. Jason, who else is next?
Margaret got back on after she lost power.
Right.
Believe it or not, of all moments, the power goes off. Okay. So my name is Margaret Kremar. Be totally transparent with you and not play any games. I am not a big advocate of hunting, but I am willing to look the other way from, for example, bow hunting, because it requires dedication and skill and the animal is on more of an equal footing. What I am riled up about is excessive, gratuitous violence, exemplified by this thermal imaging equipment regulation and also coyote or any kind of wildlife hunting tournaments, which I just found out are happening in this state. You were worried about the Kansas Livestock Association. If a rancher has a problem with a lone rogue animal that is causing significant predation problems, nobody is going to argue about his right to dispatch that animal, but to go out and kill hundreds of innocent coyotes that had nothing to do with it is ridiculous. The Kansas Livestock Association needs to man up and think about the trouble they are causing this agency and the bad reputation they are creating for this state. As a regulatory agency, you have the power to put a stop to both of these practices immediately. I do recommend that the agency do a survey because it would provide you with useful information as to how the public perceives your services, because apparently one hasn't been done for 10 years. But as for how the public would respond to hunting with thermal imaging equipment and wildlife hunting tournaments, I am confident that they would be appalled. Thank you for letting me make these comments.
Thank you, Margaret. Jason, is there anybody else who's raised their hand or want to talk?
At this time, I think that is it. I'm all clear.
All right. Mike, do you have some comments that you'd like to make?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. And I'd asked Mr. Chairman if I could make some comments. Obviously, this is Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary in Pratt. And this bases around exactly what we've been listening to here during this non-agenda item time. When commissioners receive emails on particular topics or issues, we want to streamline and we want to be able to respond and take care of those issues as efficiently as possible. And we want to do that. I think when they do write commissioners, I think their intention is that the commissioners hear and discuss these items at a public commission meeting. And I'm not sure all of them are looking for an individual response just to them based on the issues that they're asking about. We obviously, the commissioners have received several emails about crowding at our waterfowl areas. We received emails from Mrs. McCramar about night hunting for coyotes. And I think we recently received some emails about non-resident deer and leasing. And so I think each time we receive one of those, we need to come up with a plan that how we are going to address these. And then hopefully we can have, for example, public lands give a full report at the next commission meeting about hunting pressure on our public lands, what they are seeing with their check-in numbers, how that compares to last year and the year before. And I might just go on ahead and add that, Stuart has been looking at this. He and Ryan have kind of followed this. They have some very speculative ideas on why we're seeing this. One of the ideas is that they closed the borders to Canada. And so a lot of waterfowl hunters that travel north to hunt weren't able to do that. Guides and outfitters that may have operated up north may have been operating in Kansas or in some of the Midwestern states. I think we also had very good conditions in our waterfowl areas this year. We had an early migration. We held a lot of ducks for a long time, and I think word of mouth gets around. And I also will say, I think hunting pressure is a relative thing. People from Eastern Midwestern states may drive up and see 7 or 8 boat trailers in a parking lot and think nothing of it, where our residents think that is extremely heavy hunting pressure. So whether this is a one-year thing or whether this is something that may begin to grow, we're gonna talk to our public land staff, and I will have somebody at the next commission meeting provide some information and data about what they saw in check-in numbers, where the hunters were from, and what kind of hunting pressure we did see this year. And I think I would propose that we do this on most of these issues that commissioners receive emails from, that they can send a response back that I received your email. I have forwarded on to appropriate staff with the department, and that this will be something that we will talk about at a future commission meeting. Because ultimately we can spend a lot of time on a personal response to that person, but what I think they really want to do is have a public discussion or forum about this issue, and hear from our staff as well as the commissioners on what certain solutions might be to these issues. So I would ask the commissioners what they think about that. I would defer maybe to Nadia as well, because she and I have been working with her public affairs staff on how we deal with this. But I don't want to duplicate efforts. I don't want it to be inefficient. But I don't want to not provide the proper response to constituents.
Well, I think this is Gerald talking. I think that's a good point. I think all the commissioners will probably acknowledge that we have received a lot more calls since the last couple meetings. I think the public is getting more active with an electronic format. We're getting more emails. We're getting more people call in through the Zoom meeting. And quite frequently, we all get the same email, but we don't always get the same email. So what people were doing and, was trying to forward the emails on so that we could all see. So we didn't, you never know. Some people want a response and you hate to give a response, and then another commissioner gives something that's not exactly the same thing. And I think we need to figure out exactly how to deal with that, and in such a way that it doesn't violate the Kansas open meeting laws. Because if I send an email to Aaron, who sends it to Lauren, who sends it to Warren, and that in theory becomes a technical violation of the Kansas open meeting laws, and we have to be careful on how we do that. Any response would be nice to have a formatted response that we could send to acknowledge that we have it, assuming I'm technically capable of figuring it out, which some of us have to call Jason every time we do anything. So I think that's a good point. There is no question that the public is fired up over non-resident deer hunters and non-resident duck hunters. And I think it's probably more than just an isolated issue. I'm not sure I know how to fix it, but I think it's a real problem. And I think that's why we're getting so many emails and phone calls and comments, because I think it is a legitimate issue. Brad?
Yeah, thank you, Brad Lovelace from Pratt. I agree with everything you folks are saying. One of the things we really worry about is these comments or input falling through the cracks. And we know sometimes, as you said, Chairman Lauber, it comes to one commissioner, it may come to all of you, it may come to an individual within the agency. And we're thinking if we have a single point of contact, everybody agrees. When any of us get those, we make sure to send it into Bob or Betty. Then we can formulate a response, get our science together, share with you folks, our commissioners, and collectively come up with a thoughtful response. Doesn't substitute for the great discussion we have in commission meetings, which is really the heart of what we're trying to accomplish. But at least we can put our best science together for that, and we can make sure that that's shared with everybody inside the agency, inside the commission, and to our public, so that we're even-handed and especially that we don't lose track of anyone. So we love this idea, and it would be a much clearer way to communicate with much more certainty. Thank you.
A possible, Gerald here, a possible suggestion would be that when we get emails, we forward them to a central source in Pratt or in Topeka, and then somebody sends a response to the sender, but also let all the commissioners know what email came in and how you responded, so that we'll be aware in case we did not all get the same email. I appreciate Lauren and Emmerich forwarded a lot of them along, most of which I saw that had come to me, but that's about the only way we can be assured is that the commission has unity of knowledge of what some of our constituents are wanting to do. So if we could figure out a central location to forward them and then a response that we could see as commissioners, I think that would be helpful. Lauren?
Commissioner Sill, one of the things, I don't know if this is feasible, and you're probably all more aware of problems with the suggestion, but on the website with the list of commissioners, we're all listed individually and you can't CC. You have to do each copy and paste each one. But if there was a line that said email all commissioners, that just went to all of us and we knew that. I don't know if that alone is breaking that, the meetings laws. I don't want to do that. But then I know, okay, everybody got it. I don't need to forward this to the central office. And it saves me forwarding because I know right then everybody has it. But I'd also still want people to have that option to write each of us individually, because some of these have been a slightly more personal nature, whether it's a contact or their concerns. So I want to retain that piece, but an email all might be one option.
Brad?
Yeah, thank you, Brad Loves from Pratt. We discussed the same thing, Commissioner Sill. We think that's a great idea, that option. And then also a little bit more detail as far as if you want this comment to go to the agency as well, or things like that. We've had those same discussions. So we like the way you're thinking. That makes perfect sense. We want to provide better service to the public as they want to contact us, and more clarity. Everybody, whose picture I can see wants more transparency, wants to make sure that we're being open about this. I would ask our counsel, Chris Tymeson. Chris, have you heard anything about these plans or requests that you think might challenge the open meetings requirement?
Chris Tymeson, legal counsel. No, Brad, I don't think anything that we've discussed thus far gives me any pause as to open meetings. The concern for open meetings is discussion amongst the commissioners themselves. And so they couldn't take an email and then respond to all. That's the danger of the respond to all function on email. And that would violate the Open Meetings Act if it deals with issues that are going to come before the commission on public hearing ultimately. So just simply emailing those out to the commissioners would be just fine. as long as they did not have the ability to then respond to all.
Emmerich, did you have a question?
Well, I think Commissioner Sill and Mr. Lovelace covered what I was going to talk about as far as getting that information out to all commissioners. And that's the reason I was forwarding mine to Chairman, you and Mr. Lovelace and Mr. Miller, just to make sure everybody was aware of what we're receiving and the issues that are going on out there. But I think it sounds like staff has a good plan to come back and send out the protocol for us, and we'll proceed from there, I think.
Okay. Gerald here again. Yeah, I think that staff has a good idea on how to handle the emails. I'm not sure staff has an idea how to solve the complaints we're having about guides and fitters, deer hunters, however. And I think that's a real problem, and I don't know if there's a good answer, but that maybe needs to be dealt with in differently. I see down at the bottom of my screen, Warren, did you have something?
Oh, I was just going to add, this is Warren Gefeller. This is specific to the comments we got this time relative to hunting pressure, duck hunting pressure, and non-resident. Mike Miller's suggestion that we get some statistical feedback on that at the next meeting and some data on that, I think is very important in terms of just acknowledging or understanding exactly from the numbers, you know, what we're looking at. So I think that's timely and a good suggestion. And as far as all the other suggestions, I agree with all of them. The one that's probably the most meaningful to me is some kind of a generic response to these emails, and with the commitment that you know, they get discussed at commission meetings, because I'm just not comfortable at all responding to these things without having the conversation at a commission meeting.
That's a good point. Incidentally, while we're on the subject, I think the fact one email indicated that we had 50,000 non-resident permits. I don't believe that. While they do have combination permits, I think that's a bit of a misleading number. Mike Miller.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is Mike Miller and Pratt. I was going to just respond to that. And I will just say that Commissioner Sill's done a really fine job of responding and put a lot of time and effort into those without trying to solve the problem within a single email. She has just confirmed that she received it. She understands their concern. And then she's let them know that she's passed that along. But the one about deer, I think my interpretation of that particular email was that the sender had looked at the harvest report from the 2018-2019 season, and it is separated out by permits, not by deer hunters. And so it shows the number of non-resident permits, you double that. So each of those non-residents received a combo permit. So they received an either sex permit and they received an antlerless permit when they drew a permit. So instead of the total number of being 21,186, it was more like almost 50,000 if you throw in some of the over-the-counter and the non-resident hunt-owned land permits. So I think there was a misinterpretation in the numbers, and that's why I would propose that when we have these emails, we respond that we will have a discussion and we will have Levi or somebody from the agency provide the actual data on the number of hunters, and then we can deal with those issues with correct data in front of us. And the commission all are on the same page.
All right. Jason, at the bottom of my screen, I have a little yellow hand that has 2. Does that mean that there are 2 hands up who want to speak?
Yes. Yep. We have a Rod Brown and Matt. I'm not going to butcher his last name, but I'll unmute Rod now.
Okay.
So you should be unmuted.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Oh, please forgive me. It's the first time I've ever done this. 77 years old and I'm not used to this stuff, so bear with me. my concern is I pointed out to a fish and game officer what I considered an illegal bait site on public hunting for deer. He investigated it and told me there was nothing he could do because the mineral lick or salt lick that was pointed out did not have an actual block of salt in it. Now, all of us that are avid deer hunters know what a mineral lick looks like. This has been there for several years. It was several inches deep, 3 or 4 foot in diameter, had been there forever on public land. But because there wasn't an actual block of salt in there, he couldn't do anything. I think we need to take the handcuffs off the fish and game officer and figure out, if common sense tells you that's a salt lick, there are other ways to prove it's a salt lick, whether it's soil analysis or whatever. But here his hands are tied and not able to issue a summons for somebody that's violating the law. And I was wondering if you could look into maybe changing the regulations. If he has to have a block of salt in there to call it a salt lick, then anymore, a mineral lick can be powdered dust that you put out and mix it in with the soil and you'll never find it. That's my comment, commissioners. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now we have Matt. I'm going to unmute him.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Good afternoon, commissioners, Mr. Loveless, Mr. Miller. I'm sorry I got in late on the participation earlier, but I wanted to echo what Nicholas had, the concerns that he had brought up with regard to overcrowding on our public lands, and to a large degree, the rapid proliferation of guides and outfitters across the state of Kansas. I think the two issues are interrelated and interconnected. As more and more guides and outfitters operate across the state, typically, especially the run and gun variety that don't have any skin in the game, they just move from place to place, offering money to landowners and cutting out the legs from underneath the locals that may have permission to hunt on those grounds. As that happens more and more, people are forced to go to public lands, residents, and so that's happening. And then the influx of non-resident hunters coming to Kansas because we've done such a good job of advertising our waterfowl wealth here in the state. And you put the two together and you have a recipe for disaster. This has been the absolute worst year I have ever seen as far as hunting pressure on public lands goes. It's been the worst year I've ever seen as far as running into guides and outfitters, running and gunning all over the state. I think something needs to be done, and I don't think that Kansas residents should bear the brunt of whatever solution the department reaches on these issues. And I get that it's complicated, it's complex, and revenue is a component of that. You can't make everybody happy, but something has to be done. I don't think it's fair that a resident hunter that lives 10 miles from a wildlife area can't hunt it because he can't find a place to go. It's lined up with non-resident hunters. I don't think that's right. With waterfowl, and I have the utmost respect for our waterfowl area managers. They do a wonderful job. They have to deal with all sorts of variables, and they can't control any of those variables. There's one variable that they can control, though, and that's pressure. There is a way to control pressure. And I'm going to disagree with Nicholas. I do believe that we need to limit non-resident license in Kansas. They do it in South Dakota, and they have restrictions in North Dakota as well. A non-resident can come in here and buy a license, and it's good for a year. the price of that license is really inexpensive, and I don't blame non-residents for coming here. You know, I travel out of state myself, but I fully respect each individual state's discretion in managing their resources and the allotment of licenses that they sell to better serve the natural resources in their state residents. So I just wanted to voice that concern. I do think there's some solutions that are right there. They're low-hanging fruit. I'm sure there's more to it than what I can see. But I think there's some things that can be done. And the last thing I want to say is, you know, I really appreciate Ms. Quill responding to my email, and I hope that my concerns are heard, and I know there's many others like me that have the same concern. I don't envy your guys' position, but I hope that you'll take a hard look at how to resolve this without impacting the residents of this state who live here year-round by choice. And to Mr. Miller's comment about how hunting pressure is relative, that is true. People from Arkansas may think that Kansas is wide open, but we don't live in Arkansas. We live in Kansas, and I want to conclude my comment with this point. If you ever seen the movie Those Callaways, it's about a small town in New England where there's a stopover for Canada geese, and the community kind of rallies around those geese. They kind of love the geese coming in, and it's part of their heritage. Well, a businessman comes in and he says, boy, there's an opportunity here to give this town a facelift. We can bring in hunters, and we can make a lot of money here in this town. And the town elders said, well, we like our face. We don't want a facelift. And that's how I feel. I live here for the quality of life that Kansas offers. And boy, if that's taken away or just allowed to erode, that's just not a good thing. And I feel like there's things that can be done to ensure that doesn't happen. And I appreciate your time and allowing me to comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any other, Troy?
Yeah, this is Commissioner Spohr. I guess it's an interesting year in the state of Kansas, particularly with public land waterfowl hunting. Be careful for what you wish for. I've never seen anything like it out west with all the out-of-state hunters coming in. And they just overpressured the resource. The out-of-state guys don't have much to do other than hunt, so they hunt daylight to dark. And if they're not hunting, they're running the lake looking for a new place to hunt. And it just turned a resource into it was non-existent to hunt ducks. I don't know how good they were doing, but they were here. I don't think the state of Kansas can take it another year. I certainly can't. As a local, I'm not going to deal with all the problems on public lands. We've got to be thinking about something. I don't think it's going to go away. I've talked to area managers in Missouri and Southeast Kansas, and they say this has been going on for many years down there in that part of the state. That they've had the influx of people from the South, Georgia, Carolinas, Tennessee, Texas, Louisiana. They've all been coming here, but they've really made it out west now. And it's a real thing. And it happened. I guess I'd like to blame it on COVID and say that, it won't be this way next year. But I don't know if that's going to be the case. But we've got to look at something. Because a good thing has turned into, a bad thing now. Too many, we always wish that we have a lot of people and we want a lot of people to come, but when they tax their resource like they have this year, it's a problem for all the locals being able to even find a place to hunt. The outfitters, I'm seeing the same thing. The outfitters are just coming from all the outfitters out of Wichita and Claflin are coming into Ness County and Trego County, scouting for a duck shoot. You know, and they're competing with the locals on finding a duck feed. You know, it gets to be a problem when they start throwing out the money. And of course, we've hunted that same ground our whole lives by just asking the farmer. Next thing you know, he says, well, how much money you got? How much would it take to have to hunt it? So things have changed in the waterfowl industry, particularly in western half of Kansas. And we're going to have to figure out something. You know, the one thing we don't want to do is penalize. We don't want to penalize our locals or, you know, a young man that has a lifetime hunting license that lives in Kansas City and comes back and hunts on his dad's farm. But, you know, Missouri's looking at a public land permit, you know, some type of permit that you have to pay for to be able to get on public lands. And we've all got the emails. I certainly have received more emails about that than a lot of other things. So we're getting it. I don't think it's going to go away. I'm curious to hear what paid staff says about the total numbers and how many it really, you know, how many it really was. Is there any paid staff that knows how many duck stamps we sold this year compared to years past? And that's just a quickie thought of really how many there really were. But this isn't going to go away, and we're going to have to be very careful how we deal with it. So thank you.
This is Gerald again. What is our posture? We've had this discussion, and I don't remember where it ended up with guiding on public lands. How much is it unlimited? Do we have limitations?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason. There is a long history on guiding in Kansas. It goes back to when I started with the department. Prior to that, there were guides and outfitters that had to have a guide permit. In the 2000 timeframe, those permits ramped up. The department also increased its regulatory scrutiny on that activity. The legislature then came in and took the ability of the department to regulate the guiding industry slowly away. The department does have the ability to require a permit on public lands. We did so, and we ended up with 29, I think was the last year that we had it. We ran it for 3 years. It was a free permit. The idea was just to have people get it so we could get a feel for who was applying. And we had approximately 29 or 30 permits. So that's where it's at.
If a federal refuge, we can't outlaw guiding on a federal refuge, I'm assuming, because that's not we don't manage that. Would we be able to do that on state land? You're muted.
I don't think that legally you can have Chris Tymason again, sorry, a complete prohibition on guiding. That's going to take a lot more complexity. But when it comes to like waters that are controlled by the federal government, we do not have the ability to prohibit such activity.
And that would include national wildlife refuges and all of that.
Well, like a national wildlife refuge, they have exclusive administrative jurisdiction over those lands. These are going to get really complex, these questions. So I don't necessarily, if you have questions that you would like me to research, I'd be happy to do that. But in a nutshell, we still don't have the ability to regulate guides and outfitters as an industry. We just have the ability to control public lands that are under lease by the department or that we own. So that would be, in legal parlance, it's department lands and waters.
I remember when we had the guides were taken away from us because we tried to have meaningful restrictions and supervision, and that just wasn't very acceptable to them. I think Troy has a good point, and I think it's going to get worse. I looked at the amount of duck hunters over the last few years, and it sort of shows a deteriorating or a declining number. I'm guessing it will be up higher this year, but I'm not sure the statistics, unless maybe we look at number of days hunted, are going to give us an answer. I don't have an answer for it, but I think it's a real issue. And I would hate to see too many guides and outfitters foul it up for everybody. And I think that's the direction it's starting to go. We better move on. Is there any more public comment items? Mike?
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, commercial guiding is not allowed on land that we manage, right, Chris?
Okay, that's a complex. It's not a ban on commercial activity or ban on guiding. You cannot conduct commercial activity, a business on department lands and waters unless you have a permit issued by the department. So like a concession for a marina, they have an agreement with us, for example, and they can conduct commercial activity. But somebody couldn't just take a food truck out to a state park and set up and start doing business. So those are general regulations. The Corps also has those general regulations related to conducting commercial activity on public property.
Well, then are the guides that are on Cheyenne Bottoms, which is our managed property, are they on there legally, or are they just hard to spot?
I think, Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason again, I think that when this is a difficult issue, what is a commercial guide and a commercial activity? We've spent a lot of time on these issues over the years, but if I have a guide service, for example, and I decide I'm going to take the secretary duck hunting that day, and we're just friends and we're going out to hunt, but it's on the side of my truck, it takes a lot more than just seeing something that appears to be a guide to prove that it's actually a guided trip and a business operation. But that's a very difficult case to make.
Was it Potter Stewart who had the quote on pornography? I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. You can kind of see a guide, but maybe you don't know whether he's really a guide or not. All right. Mike, Troy, anything more?
I would just add, Mr. Chairman, Mike Miller and Pratt, that when I listened in on some of the Midwestern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies sessions, this isn't unique to Kansas. Other Western states where the governor allowed or said outdoor recreation is allowable under the lockdown saw very heavy use of their wildlife areas and their lakes. Some of them talked about a lot of stress on their staff, confrontation between users. It's not unique to Kansas. And, you know, we've seen some dramatic changes in the number of people using our areas during the pandemic. There's been no doubt about it. When we saw high school sports and traveling teams and all those activities cease, people went outside. And so I'm not going to tell you this is going to go away. I have no idea what's going to happen in the future, but this is an unusual year, as Troy said. We haven't seen anything like this before in our lifetimes.
Okay. Let's move on to the secretary's remarks on the agenda. Brad?
Oh, Gerald, this is Jason. We actually had somebody raise their hand. Do you want to
continue
that's public comment?
Let them talk.
Okay. And then Nadia's got a statement that somebody put in the comment. Dustin Washburn, I'm going to unmute you here.
We good?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Just briefly, wanted to, first of all, thank you guys for giving me a second here, but kind of wanted to piggyback on Commissioner Spore's dealings with and seeing the kind of things that he's dealt with in the western half of the state this year, and reiterate that he's spot on. You know, I have the fortunate ability to spend enough time in the outdoors that I probably see more than the vast majority of guys that hunt a couple days a week. And out this way, you know, heck, we'd see 2-3 out-of-state vehicles a year. And I'm not just talking necessarily on public lands, but this year, you know, there's trailers from Minnesota, Texas, and guys trying to chase geese and ducks all over the place. And obviously it's a resource for all, and that's not my place to tell them whether or not they can do it. But I can reiterate the fact that there's been a heck of a lot more of them in the last this year for sure. You know, we've seen it ramp up a little bit the last couple, but it's just getting almost out of hand this year. And as he said, you know, getting permission from guys you've been able to hunt on for 10, 15, 20 years, all of a sudden, you know, asking you for some money to get in there and shoot. And, you know, we all enjoy doing it, but there comes a point where, you know, I'm not going to go spend $500 or whatever for me and my son to go shoot 3 or 4 or 5 geese. That's just not feasible. So I just wanted to reiterate where, you know, in our neck of the woods, we are seeing a heck of a lot more than that, of that. And secondly, just briefly changing subjects on you quick, is there any update on the 21-inch walleye initiative, more specifically to Cedar Bluff, but just statewide generally? I know not a lot of people are thinking about that quite yet, but it's going to be here before we know it. And I was just curious if anything had come of that.
Mike, do you have any response on that?
Mike Miller from Pratt. I'm going to defer to Doug Nygren. I see he just showed up, so I will let Doug Nygren, Director of our Fisheries Division, talk.
This is Doug. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We are continuing to monitor the 21-inch link limit. We're pleased to see some improvement in body condition at Cedar Bluff in our fall samples. Our biologist is recommending to stay the course on the 21-inch link limit going into next year, and we will continue to evaluate the impacts there. We had a couple of years of poor gizzard shad production, but this year we saw a nice return to the normal amount of forage that we've had traditionally at Cedar Bluff. So we'll be watching it there. The other locations that we have the 21s on, most of those have been in place for quite some time. Milford was, I think, the most recent change. Cheney and El Dorado continue to do well. And the goal there is to control white perch. And in other locations, we're trying to protect walleye to larger sizes in order to have adequate numbers of females for broodstock and egg production for the hatcheries. So at this point, I think we're on track. Our walleye initiative is alive and well. We're expanding our ability to produce more walleye in the hatchery system. Milford Hatchery is gearing up to raise more intermediate size walleye. We have a new construction project at Meade right now that'll produce about 500,000 walleye fingerlings per year there, and another 30,000 9-inch walleye in lakes that we need to stock a larger size fish. So we're continuing to evaluate our walleye initiative and increase production, and we're anticipating some really good walleye fishing coming into this next season.
Thanks for that, Doug. And I just one final thing, I guess my only concern would be, you know, you talk about saving the bigger females and stuff like that. I guess why are we keeping 5 on Cedar Bluff if that's, you know, if that's the ultimate goal? And that'll be the last thing I've got to say. So again, I appreciate your guys' time, but that would be my last question.
Eric, can you hear me now? It wouldn't let me unmute. The goal at Cedar Bluff is not necessarily for broodstock egg collection there. That one was geared at improving the opportunity for anglers to catch larger walleye. So we're not really trying necessarily to do the broodstock operation there as much as we are just trying to enhance the size and take advantage of the potential that lake has to produce more pounds of walleye. Oftentimes when we put the 21 on, it results not only in more eggs, but actually a higher number of walleye that are harvested because they're harvested at a larger size. So as long as we can keep the annual fishing mortality low, our yield actually can go up with the link limit. We can have more pounds of walleye caught, not as many numbers, but just as many pounds, if not more, by protecting them for just a little bit longer.
All right, thank you. Nadia, did you have something you want to read into the record?
Yes, thank you. Nadia Reimer, Chief of Public Affairs. We had one constituent who has shared a statement, a written statement. So this is regarding deer, and it's in 3 parts, so just bear with me. Could someone educate me as to, this is from Shane Horsch. Could someone educate me as to who truly controls the deer regulations? I.e., how did we end up that residents can hunt any season statewide, non-residents can hunt in 2 units, over-the-counter tags, etc.? I started hunting deer in the 80s when the biologists seemed to use sound science to manage the deer herd. Now it's all about the revenue, it seems. Would love to learn who is hamstringing the biologists at the KWPT for managing the deer herd using sound science instead of by dollar signs. I firmly believe the lack of any deer management has led to a lot of problems we are seeing today. Deer were seen by the department or the legislature as the low-hanging fruit. If we have more access, we could move over to a model similar to South Dakota or other Western states with more open access. And then he added a little bit of a clarifying statement. What he meant is more hunting opportunities will equal more hunting license sales, more tourism, etc. Right now, the free-for-all on deer has had the opposite effect. It is leading to limiting hunting access more and more.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else that before I start with the secretary's remarks?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, if you and Secretary Lovelace are good with this, I'd be happy to have Public Affairs kind of lead the way in terms of improving our constituent communications. Public Affairs could outline some of the things we discussed today, and given your guys' feedback, I think we can craft a recommendation for how we can improve that system. So if you're good with it, we'll lead the charge and then get something down on paper for you guys to review.
That's fine with me.
Okay.
All right. Secretary Lovelace.
Thank you, Chairman Lauber. This is Brad Lovelace from Pratt. So I wanted to give you an update on our fiscal status for the agency. We do appreciate the governor's budget that was published this week and basically granting our request for the next budget cycle. Our EDIF apportionment will remain the same at $5.1 million plus a little more. Wildlife Parks and Tourism will hold our budget static from fiscal year 21 to 22. And we are, as I mentioned in the past, trying to add more details to our budgeting process, again, just for more transparency and more clarity. On the Park Fee Fund and state parks, the revenue for 2020 finished up from 2019 by 36%. Now remember, 2019 was our flood year. So we were down a little bit, but we were much higher in 2020, just as you all would suspect based on the reports you were hearing. A few details, the revenue from May and June were at historic levels as we had our first $2 million months in our state parks ever. December revenues were up from last year, and we settled in at $1.4 million, up from just about half of that last year. So that takes into account reservations going forward. Currently, we're up about 52% in total revenues from this same time last year, and the current cash balance in the Park Fee Fund is just over $6 million. And last year, at this time, we were just over $2 million. Now, the one thing I would point out, and I talked with the governor about this the other day to make it clear, it wasn't that long ago when we were full up with water everywhere. And if you remember that the flooding in 2019 produced just under $10 million worth of maintenance that we were required to do. We didn't have the money or the ability to correct all those things all at once. So as we've been getting money, some from the state general fund, which we appreciated, but then as we get these new revenues, like we got in 2020, we're applying those to the roads, to the boat ramps, to the docks, the structures that were lost in the 2019 flood. So we have good places to put the revenue we've gotten. Also, as you'd expect, with all the extra visitation, our costs were up this year, right? It takes people and resources to accommodate all those extra visitors. And so, but we are very pleased at the way it finished up. Linda and her folks did terrific work in getting us through that year in great shape. A lot of satisfied customers, and hopefully we'll get them back again in 2021. Our cabin revenue last year finished up 10% over the previous year. If you recall, some of our cabins that had carpet and things like that were hard to clean out of safety concerns for the public, excuse me, we felt like we didn't know that we could adequately clean all those surfaces in the short amount of time required to turn it over to new visitors. And so some of those we did not allow visitors for 2020, again, out of safety concerns. That affected our cabin revenue some. The Wildlife Fee Fund was up overall about 10% from this time last year, so that's good news also. Our budget balance at the end of fiscal year 20, the end of December of last year was $14.7 million. And at the end of, so that's great news for us. Federal funds are expected to stay consistent. As you're aware, the matching funds we get from the Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson are based on the sports men and women's expenditures when it comes to fishing and hunting gear. And we all know that there was a lot of gear sold in 2020. There was a question for a while about how that would translate into revenue for us, but the picture looks good. We still have to generate matching money on our side to leverage that federal funds. So protecting and expanding our Wildlife Fee Fund dollars is really important. And that way we'll be able to best leverage that federal money in the future for projects that we're doing across the state. The one other comment I might mention, Mr. Chair, is so a couple comments about more public lands. We are in favor of that. We're constantly working to procure more public lands for use in Kansas. There's a tension there, as you're all aware, but we're trying to look for opportunities there. We work with our partners, Pheasants Forever and Ducks Unlimited, for those properties around the state, and they work constructively with us, but it's a challenge. We have to get properties of decent size approved by the legislature. So that's part of the approval process we go through. And that's been complex with the legislative changes that have happened for COVID. Nevertheless, we continue to move in that direction. We feel like we have a good case for needing more public land. We aren't very far from the bottom in the US as far as the percent of public lands that we have. And so as our constituents reach out to us and say we need to do more of that, we'll love to engage them as we have constructive conversations with our legislators about how we navigate that and are able to get more of those for public use in the future. With that, I have one more thing to offer, but I would stand for questions if there are any, Chairman.
Does anybody have any questions for Brad? Hearing none, you want to go ahead with your...
I would. Thank you, Chairman Lauber. I have a presentation to make, but because of social distancing, it's going to take me about 30 seconds to get to that office. So I will hustle up there and be back with you in just a second.
Okay.
Surprise. I don't know where our camera is, Sheila.
It's
right there. Hello, everyone. I'll kneel down here. I'm proposing marriage to Sheila Kim. No, I'm I have a plaque here from the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. This is a group of our central United States agencies, and Sheila and her husband Dan have been supporting them administratively for 20 years. And on this plaque that they asked that we pass on to Sheila and Dan, it says, "For your many years of faithful, dedicated secretarial service excellence." And the reason why I think they put many years is they're hoping that their service doesn't end anytime soon. They have really appreciated Sheila's work, and she's been terrific. She supports them with really nothing other than a plaque like this as a thank you. So they are, Sheila and Dan are near and dear to the hearts of everyone in the Midwest Association because of the friendships and the great service that they provided. So on their behalf, I want to present this to Sheila and Dan Kemps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Mr.
Black.
Chair.
Thank you very much, Sheila.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Sheila.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll move on. I think that concludes Brad's report. 2021 legislature, Chris?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, legal counsel. The 2021 legislature kicked off on Monday. The governor gave her state of the state Tuesday evening, and the budget was released yesterday. So things are just kicking off. It's the very beginning of a 2-year session. Last year, the session was cut short because of COVID, so ended abruptly in March. There is an attempt this year. The legislature has funded electronics technology in order to facilitate those meetings. I think they're hamstrung by the way the Constitution reads and a ruling from the Attorney General's office as to how they can vote on bills and a final action. And so I think that this session is going to be very complex. I think there are a lot of details being ironed out still, or technological challenges in relation to how things operate. In the Capitol, there's concern, obviously, because of the pandemic, and I think it's going to be very challenging for the agency and all of state government or constituents who would like to see bills passed and have lobbyists, or getting all of that to funnel through those technological and physiological challenges of the pandemic. With that, there are 2 bills that have been introduced so far. One would be House Bill 2025, and it was introduced by Representative Ken Corbett, and the title says Protecting Private Property from Unauthorized Access by Certain Government Officials and Unauthorized Surveillance. I have not had a chance to fully analyze the impacts of the bill, but essentially, in order to conduct some sort of electronic surveillance or physical surveillance of a property would require a warrant and it's directed at the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism, and then noxious weed officers or officials in those counties. There is a case from Tennessee, I recall from last year, that is a district court case, the last I knew, that deals with this issue directly. I don't know what the genesis of the bill is, and it was pre-filed. We haven't had any discussions on it with anybody else. So if there are no questions, I'll move on. Okay. Then House Bill 2032 in relation to coyotes and night vision equipment and spotlighting, it would remove the ability of the department or the commission to regulate that activity, to allow that activity. Those are the only two bills that have been introduced. We do have our own legislative package. Some of the things that the secretary discussed, like public lands, we're talking about adding to Kingman Wildlife Area. But there are a lot of other things because of the complexity of the pandemic and the technology challenges on the legislative package. I think that our legislative package is changing a little bit, from, we had a more expansive package of 7 or so items, and we still may be able to accomplish that, but I'm just not sure at this time.
Okay. Chris, Gerald, is there a particular incident or issue that has caused Representative Corbett to propose this, pre-file this bill?
I don't know the answer to that. He didn't contact us in relation to this bill that I'm aware of.
Commissioner Sill, who is the sponsor on HB 2032?
That was also a pre-filed bill, and it was Representative Carmichael.
Okay, and are those both going to go through like the Ag Committee first?
They've both been assigned to the Ag Committee. That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Is standing on the road with binoculars, looking on some property, warrantless surveillance?
I haven't had a chance to fully analyze that, Mr. Chairman. So I don't necessarily want to get into scenarios that may or may not fall under the bill.
All right. Any other questions for Chris? Okay, let's go to the general discussion. Now we're going to see how us commissioners are going to draw these ping pong balls, Miller. So are you?
Mike is going to do it.
I'm going to have to ask your permission to let me draw as your proxy.
You have my permission.
And we'll do it on video so you can see how I reach in there and how I don't look and see what number I'm going to pull out. But to get it done today, I'm going to do the drawing. I'll give you a brief overview of the Commissioner Big Game permits. This is allowed by KSA 32970. It allows the commission to issue 7 big game permits. They can do 1 elk, 1 antelope, or a total of 7 deer. And we started this in 2006. It's been pretty popular. It's grown, not only the number of applications, you'll see in the briefing booklet how they have grown over the years, but the money that's raised each year has grown as well. And last year we had 209 applications and they raised $146,080. So it's significant. I think if you look back when this started, we've raised more than $700 for conservation programs and projects through this Commissioner's Big Game Permit program. So obviously it's open to nonprofit conservation organizations and local chapters that operate in Kansas. They have to actively promote wildlife conservation as well as the hunting and fishing heritage. A chapter or an organization can only receive one of these permits once in a 3-year period. Once they receive a permit, if they're drawn, the price of the permit is subtracted out of whatever they sell that permit for. Now they can sell it. They have figured out how to market these and do these through online bidding or however they do it, but they have figured out how to market these. But once they do sell that permit, the price of the permit, which is $457.50, is subtracted out. 15% of that cost is kept by that chapter or that organization to be spent at their discretion. And then 85% is returned to the agency with a proposal for a conservation project. Once that is approved, that money is returned to them to conduct that project. Oftentimes, For example, groups will just donate that money to, say, like Bring Back the Bottoms if a DU chapter won it, or the Pheasant Initiative. A lot of times Pheasants Forever chapter would donate to the Pheasant Initiative. But it is a mutually agreed upon conservation project that money will be spent on. So unless we have any questions about what we've done in the past, if you want to go through any of that, I will get on with the drawing. It's really up to the commission and the folks that are listening if they want to have any questions about that.
Are there any questions? If not, get on with the drawing.
All right. Sheila, how many applications did we have this year? Was it 200?
We had 229. We had 208 eligible out of that 229 because 11 of them had won in the last 3 years. 7 were duplicate applications. They came from 2 different people for the same chapter. And 3 chapters were no longer active. So we pulled those. So we ended up with 208 eligible applications.
And last year there was 209. In 2019, there was 176. 2018, 154. So you can see interest has grown. This is a viable way to raise private money for public conservation programs. And it's turned out to be a really neat deal. So I have the bin that you're all familiar with. And since I don't have any way of doing this, I'm going to go in the order that the commissioners appear on my screen. So the first one that I see is Troy, Commissioner Sporer. So I'm going to be drawing in your name right now. I'm going to reach down deep into there. I'm going to pull out eight. Is that what that is, Sheila, with an underline there? 8-8?
Yes.
88.
88 is Ducks Unlimited in Cedar Bluff. Their first choice is a deer.
Shake it up a little bit. Reach in again. This is going to be for Commissioner Sill. 126. 126.
126 is Pheasants Forever, Saline County. Their first choice is a deer.
This one has come kind of near the top. 83, and this one is for Commissioner Ryder.
83 is Ducks Unlimited, Russell chapter.
Okay. Chairman Lauber, you're next on my screen. '87, 87.
87 is Ducks Unlimited, Beaver Valley, Atwood chapter.
Are all these last 2 chosen deer?
Yes, I'm sorry, they are deer, yes. Everything so far has been deer.
I'm going to draw for Commissioner Gefeller. 211. 211.
211. And the reason that we have 211 instead of 208 being the last number is because those 3 inactive chapters were pulled after they had been numbered. So that's why. So 211 is the Kansas Wildscape Foundation, and their choice is a deer.
Commissioner Cross. 164.
164 is Quail Forever, Heartland Pioneer chapter. Their choice is a deer.
This is the last one, right? Commissioner Hazlett. 26.
26 is Ducks Unlimited Chisholm Trail Park City chapter. And their choice is a deer.
And that concludes the drawing. And
Thank
obviously,
you.
if it looks like there is a particular, it seems like a lot of Ducks Unlimited or Pheasants Forever chapters usually draw these, and that's because there are so many of those chapters in the state, and almost all of those chapters do apply. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's move on to youth seasons alignment. Jake?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. I am going to have a PowerPoint for you, so if you'll bear with me for just a moment, I will get my screen share going. Everybody seeing the youth seasons alignment slide?
Yes.
Okay, good deal. All right, my name is Jake George. I'm the Wildlife Division Director located in our Pratt Operations Office. Today I'm going to be presenting to you an overview of our youth seasons and the respective ages at which individuals are eligible to participate. The end goal of these discussions is going to be to simplify and standardize these to one age, which on its face seems simple enough. However, as most things go, when delving into the specifics of regulations and statutes, we have several separate but parallel items to consider when looking at this. So I plan to provide a summary of our current, I can get this to operate through here, possibly, there we go. Kind of provide a summary of our current regulations, go over our options for changes and the processes associated with each option, in the hopes that doing so will facilitate a discussion and we can kind of chart a path forward with this. I will not be making any recommendations at this time. This is really more for general discussion, and everything's open for discussion. And with the decisions that we make, they're actually going to be handled for the regulatory votes per the individual species coordinators with the different 25 series regs, which I'll get into a little bit later in discussing the process. So this is youth seasons alignment. So what we're discussing are potential changes strictly for the age of eligibility for participation in youth only seasons for quail, pheasant, deer, turkey, and waterfowl. We're not discussing licenses, not youth permits, not at the moment anyways. However, as you'll see, these should all be considered in relation to the youth season age discussion, and depending on our decisions there, may require changes in the future. Some with the commission, regulatory changes, and some potentially changes through legislative action with statutes. So current regulations for the age of eligibility to participate in youth seasons are under the age of 17 for quail, pheasant, deer, and turkey, and under the age of 16 for waterfowl. Now, the reasoning for the waterfowl being different at one point in time, that was aligned with the federal duck stamp and mandated to be less than 16 for the age for the waterfowl youth seasons. And that changed several years ago. And we'll get into that a little bit here in a moment. So it seems fairly straightforward to align or even to expand opportunity with those. But when you look at it at a broader perspective of ages for various youth licenses, permit and stamp requirements, the waters become a little bit murkier, and we begin to add on caveats for what is required for youth in the field, when they're allowed to hunt, who is required to be with them at different times, and what types of permits they can or are required to have in their possession. So this table was included with your briefing book for reference, and was my attempt to boil down both youth eligibility and licensing for requirements in both Kansas and several surrounding states. The good news out of it was, after looking at everything in the other states, that Kansas was not the most confusing.
However, we were also not the least confusing when it comes to youth participation and licensing requirements. We'll walk through a comparison with some of the other states in a moment, but I'm going to take a minute first to explain the table and how the various columns relate to our discussion here. So first thing of note, you'll notice over on the right in that table, the most limiting factor of which we have no ability to easily change is the age at which a federal duck stamp is required. As a state, you can either align with this or have it as an exception to the rule that you define for participation in seasons or hunting license requirements or youth permit eligibility, but it's going to stay that way as far as we know, and we can't change that. So the next limiting factor is going to be the columns you see there, which are the both youth turkey, deer, waterfowl stamps, hunting licenses. Those are all handled or mandated, I guess, within statute as far as what those ages are. That's nothing that we can go in and change. It would require legislative action. So those, our state waterfowl permit is included on there because that's tied, not specifically mentioned in statute, but it's tied to the age at which a hunting license is required, which is included in statute. Now, these four columns here, the youth upland season, so pheasant and quail, deer, turkey, and waterfowl. These columns within the chart are all ones that can be modified through the regulatory process of the commission. And the age of eligibility for participation in the youth waterfowl season can also be modified, but we can simply do that by noting it within the season selection letter that we submit to the Fish and Wildlife Service. It would not require a vote from the commission per se, just consensus there. Now we'll look some at Kansas in particular and how we compare with some of our surrounding states. Currently in Kansas, when looking at the broader picture of participation eligibility and licensing requirements for youth, the youth seasons for pheasant, quail, deer, and turkey are the exceptions at under 17. Everything else is currently under 16, and that pertains to everything here in this chart, as well as the youth only and youth mentor fishing access locations that are also defined within regulation as under the age of 16 for access. There are 4 states out of the 10 that were reviewed that are consistent at under 16 across the board. It's very straightforward and easy to understand, but it would require the removal of a year of opportunity from our current youth seasons to accomplish that in Kansas. Both Colorado and New Mexico to our west have standardized at under the age of 18, accepting required permits and stamps for waterfowl, which again gets into that kind of limiting factor of the federal duck stamp requirement. And then having to be different, Texas, of course, is standardized, but at under the age of 17 across the board. And again, accepting it's less than 16 still for the federal waterfowl stamp. Oklahoma is fairly similar, probably the most similar to Kansas, accepting the years that or the age of eligibility for their youth seasons for a deer and turkey are set at under the age of 18 already. They maintained under the age of 16 for waterfowl, and it's still the same at under the age of 16 for requiring a hunting license. So if they're basically where we would be if we were to change only the age of eligibility for participation in youth seasons to under 18. And I'm not going to go into them, but when I mentioned that we weren't the worst as far as being the most complex, South Dakota and Wyoming are rather complex, so I'm not going to go into the summaries on those because they don't really compare to anything that we're looking at the moment for changes. This slide looks a little bit different. Got reformatted some, but hopefully you guys can still see everything on there. Basically, everything's up for discussion at this point, but in the interest of facilitating discussion, I have developed a couple of options for consideration and identified several pros and cons for each. The first would be lowering the youth season eligibility age to less than 16. So that puts us in line with Missouri, Nebraska, Arkansas, Iowa, those states where it is everything across the board. This is, I guess, from a recruitment standpoint, it's easy for both youth and mentors to understand. It's certainly simplified, but the con there is we do have, at least with respect to what we currently offer for ages of eligibility for pheasant, quail, deer, and turkey, a loss of a year of eligible participation. Option 2 that we've been considering is going ahead and raising the youth season eligibility age to less than 18. So you may have to buy an adult permit, you may have to have your hunting license, but you're still eligible at the ages of 16, 17 to go out and participate during those youth seasons, albeit you still have to have somebody who's 18 years of age or older with you during those seasons. So I guess the cons there, it's a disparate ages for participation versus permits. It's not quite as easy to explain. It does increase a year of participation eligibility and would align us similarly with what it's like in Oklahoma. And then looking down the road, we could potentially pursue legislative action in the future after kind of some additional analysis regarding fiscal impacts, et cetera, of changing both the requirement age for hunting licenses as well as other permits and stamps and availability of or access to the reduced price youth permits up to the age of 18. So that's kind of the summary of what we've been discussing. Oh, now those came in. Now it looks better. So that's kind of what the visuals would be like for those two options that we'd be looking at. I'll probably go back to that one in a second so we have it in front of us. But as far as timing goes, I like to make Chris sweat things with getting regs in, but we are going to have a public hearing in March. So that was going to be the first limiting factor here with timing, with making some of these decisions. If we are to include that as a part of the Deer 25 series that's coming up, that will have to be in place and that decision made by March. Next would be we can make the change with our season selection letter that goes to Fish and Wildlife Service with waterfowl. Jeff is going to be bringing up the 25 series for quail and pheasant today that we would generally be voting on in June. And then turkey, if we were to make the change, we'd be taking that up with the next normal cycle for turkey discussions beginning in June. Now, if we do decide to make the change across the board and try to standardize it as under the age of 18 for both eligibility to participate in youth seasons as well as access youth-only locations, such as our fishing locations, Doug would be taking that up as part of the fishing regs the discussions beginning this spring. So with that, I field any questions or discussion, and I'll probably go back to this option slide just so you guys have it in front of you.
Okay. Is there any discussion from the commission on this?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Warren Gefeller, I've got a question. Can you describe the pros and cons of adding 1 year of eligibility or subtracting 1 year of eligibility?
Yeah, I guess the pro from subtracting it is that everything's standardized across the board. We have, if you're going to participate in a youth season, you are eligible to purchase youth reduced price permits, and you are not required to have a hunting license. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to explain across the board. The con to that, obviously, is that as a 16-year-old, you'll no longer be eligible to participate in the youth seasons as you can now for deer, turkey, and upland birds.
Okay, that's really the nature of my question. If you lose that year of eligibility for that hunter, do you lose them as a hunter the next year? I mean, why would we want?
Right. Well, you have to remember that this is just specific to the youth seasons. There's nothing saying that as a 16-year-old, you couldn't hunt during the regular season still. It's right. Just pertaining to your eligibility to hunt during that early youth specific season when you have to have somebody 18 or older with you.
Mm-hmm.
This is Commissioner Lauber. I think Commissioner Gefeller has a good point, and that's one of my concerns. We've had discussions previously about crowding and waterfowl and this type of thing. I really think it makes more sense to raise the eligibility as much as possible to try to reach out and get more recruitment. Yes, I realize that there may be some sort of confusion, but to make it easy for a mentor to understand, we take away a year of opportunity. I think we want to encourage more people to get out and hunt in that youth season. And they're at the age to where their experience at 16 and 17, 15 may be the difference to make them want to do it indefinitely. So I think that we run a risk of losing them, and we at least ensure they'll have more exposure by expanding the time. Other commissioners.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Spoor. Isn't the idea is to make it so it's less confusing? It seems like to me, I have lots of people ask me about what age can they do this and that. And it's confusing to me. Is the whole reason why we're talking about this is to standardize it so it's less confusing for people? Is that how we're supposed to be thinking about this? Jake?
Well, I could answer that, and it depends on which hat I have on. As a department employee and somebody who understands recruitment and retention, and Tana can speak to this some from an R3 perspective, but standardizing it and simplifying our regulations is one of the focuses of the R3 movement, and has been identified as beneficial to recruiting new people to the sport. As a dad who understands the regulations, of course, I have some insider knowledge with them, but as a dad, I'd love those extra 2 years of opportunity to take my kids with me. So it's a really difficult decision, and part of the reason we didn't come straight forward with a recommendation is because I wanted to have some discussion on it, because there's not really, it's one or the other. You can't have both. So.
And Commissioner Feller, again, and that was the reason for my question. I don't know that I have an opinion, and it sure makes a lot of sense to try to simplify things. And if standardizing the age would do that, that makes sense on the surface. But what I was trying to understand is what we're giving up with that lost year of eligibility. And if we do have an opinion or even some past history that we might be losing participation from this group if they lose that eligibility too young or at 16, well, that's I think certainly worth a discussion.
Tana, are you out there? If you would like to weigh in from the R3 perspective because I know that's some of the discussions you guys have is regarding the benefits of simplified permitting requirements, et cetera.
Will Jason have to unmute her? I see her name there. I see her listed. Jason, can you unmute Tana?
Yep, I'm on. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. And thanks, Jake, for bringing me in here. I sure appreciate it. I echo Jake's comments in that the real focus here is on the simplification. And I wouldn't be comfortable making a recommendation as this point. However, that has been a large talking point in R3 lately, is that simplification. Citing some of the work done by Nevada recently, they've had great success simplifying their entire licensing structure. And their two main goals have been to remove the laws and regulations that were confusing and potential barriers to participation, and to simplify their license structure in a revenue neutral manner. Something to bring up from this is they actually conducted focus groups where they first did a comparative analysis to see how Nevada compared to other prices and other like age structures similar to what Jake presented today. And they went through a 4-step process. And one of those steps was conducting focus groups. In focus groups, thank you. They actually got some feedback that said, I want to obey the law. And there are approximately 6 different regulations. There might be a 7th thing I don't even know about. If that was the case, I would avoid the activity altogether. So that was feedback that Nevada got directly from their focus groups of like, the more complicated something is, the more I completely avoid it. So to speak to your comments, yes, like in Jake's situation, he has a lot of experience. He understands those regulations, and he and his kids benefit from that extra year of youth participation. However, if I was hoping to get into hunting with my 15, 16-year-old and I wasn't sure, okay, we can participate here and we can't then, that would be a different situation. We came up with similar feedback in our diversity, equity, and inclusion work when we worked with our Spanish-speaking focus group. And the feedback we received from them that one of their biggest barriers to participation was being afraid of breaking the law. And so that fear of breaking the law or having to interact with law enforcement does prevent them from participation. So I say that just to further agree that the simplification is a top priority of R3 to make it more customer centric. But I do not have any direct recommendations as to where that be 16 or 18 at this time. That will require some additional research and I think some focus group and survey work as well.
Yeah, other comments from the commissioners?
Yeah, Commissioner Ryder, I would echo that. That's been my experience. Of course, I deal with high school age students all the time. And that's the information that I've received. And I've had lots of parents come and contact me and talk to me about it and say, hey, you know, we might not do an activity. They might not, you know, be duck hunters, or they might not do quail hunting all the time. And they're not sure exactly how it's supposed to be. And so they just say, forget it, you know. And so I think that is a big barrier that a lot of people face. And if we can get those kind of straight across the board, I think that would eliminate a lot of the barriers that we see with these getting kids out and involved. Yeah, you hate to lose a year or two, but I think that barrier is really restricting people as it is. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Other questions?
As one who, this is Commissioner Sill. One of the things I try to do, particularly in that October whitetail antlerless season, is to try and take out some youth or new hunters. I found that the cutoff at 16 has eliminated me being able to take some folks, or at least it's made it more complicated. Whereas, oh yeah, you can go till you're 18. It's all easy. Let's, you know, get the tags and go. That's particular to the deer hunting. But here's a different perspective that I haven't heard anyone address yet. One of the things drilled into me was that everyone needs to do their part. And when we pay for our licenses and when we pay for permits and things, as well as taking care of the land, things like that, that's all part of doing our part. I think there is some benefit to young people learning to pay for their permits or realize there is a cost that goes towards care of the resources, and yet still being able to go as a youth. So that what it is, it's a 1 or 2 year step there into learning to do their part versus a free ride, in essence, for a couple of years. I think there's an investment there that's a good thing, that by upping that age, having them pay for some permits for a year or two, there's a piece there. I'm maybe not articulating it very well, but hopefully you'll understand what I'm saying.
Chairman Lauber, I do understand what you're saying, and that makes some sense. But of course, I would like to have that extra year, and I've already made that clear. Are there other questions, comments from the commission?
Chairman Lauber, this is Commissioner Cross. I agree with your comments. I would like to see that that increase that year of participation eligibility to and maximize that opportunity for the youth. I would like one clarification from staff is by doing that, they still purchase their license or permit, correct?
Yes, that's correct. they would be eligible to participate during the youth seasons, but once they hit the age of 16, so when they're 16 and 17, they would be required to have their hunting license, and they would be required to purchase a deer permit or a turkey permit, but they would not be eligible to purchase a reduced price youth permit. So.
Okay, Jake, thank you.
Okay, any other questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman, this is Nadia Reimer, Chief of Public Affairs. We had an individual who posted a comment privately, so I'll read it off for him. Travis K. would like to ask, knowing that it would take time and require going to legislature, is there any reason to not look into raising the upland, deer, turkey, and waterfowl participation ages and subsequently pursue raising the other participation ages?
Okay.
Well, I will say that was kind of the potentially pursue legislative action in the future with option 2 there, is we could, if we decide to now, raise those to up to the age of 18 for participation in the upland deer, turkey, and waterfowl seasons. At least we could look at hunting licenses as well as the age at which you're eligible to purchase a reduced price deer or turkey permit as potential legislative action, but it would require us going to the legislature and having statutes changed.
Okay.
Commissioner Gefeller again. Jake, you got any sense or opinion what the reaction would be if you did pursue the legislative action?
I would default to Chris on that. It would be reducing fees for a user group, so I can't anticipate we would get much. But as far as anything going through, at least this year, it sounds like that might not be that likely.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I would consider, or I would encourage the group to consider that if a complicated process can be seen as a barrier, and I understand that extra year is important. However, if something is considered a complicated barrier early on, it's unlikely that we'll be able to reactivate that person down the line. So if at age 15, they decide that the licensing process to get into hunting is too difficult for them to participate, it might be difficult to change their mind down the line if we'd like them to participate when they're 30 or 40 and potentially bring their families out someday. So I hope that's something that we'll consider as well.
Any other questions or comments? I guess we don't have to take any action today.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I'm sorry. We actually do need to have a direction if we're going to make a change for the deer season. I have to know that today in order to get it in the regulation process.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mike Miller, Assistant Secretary, just to clarify, we don't need legislative action to change the age limits. We can do that through the regulatory process. The only thing we need to go through the statutes was to change the minimum age for a hunting license. So in the statute, it says if you're 16, you have to have a hunting license, right, Chris?
Right, but there's also, sorry, Chris, also statutes, which Chris pointed out to me earlier today, that define the age at which we can provide those half-price youth permits.
Okay.
Chris, if we don't lower the age limit, do we have to do anything relative to deer season then?
I guess there's a third option, which is to not do anything on the youth ages. We still have a disparity.
But if we raise it to 18, is there anything you have, if that turns out to be the goal or the direction, does that require you to do anything as far as a time limit or time frame?
So, Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, in the regulations that set the seasons that we're currently working on, in order to have youth under 18 be able to participate, I have to make a change in that regulation before I can publish it for vote in March. And that time frame is coming very close. So what Jake had proposed is if we are moving in that direction, the first change would be for deer. And then we would follow it up with waterfowl and upland birds, and then turkeys in that process, and then fishing. So if we are, I just need to have a direction as we go out of here, whether we're going to lower, whether we're going to increase those years of participation or remain the same.
This is a question, Commissioner Sill. So regardless, unless we do nothing in this process, because of how we're going to have to deal with each of these seasons independently, it is going to get more complicated for a year till it's all done before it's simplified. Is that correct? If we do deer now, we do something else later, they're going to look disparate for a while, but in the end, it will be more, it may be more consistent. Is that correct?
Correct. This is Jake George. That it would appear if you were tracking it closely, but as far as having them in place before the season would roll around, they would all be. So.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm getting it correct in my head.
Is there
Commissioner,
option 1 and option 2? Option 3 would be do nothing.
Yep, it's Jake George. Like I said, everything's on the table at this point.
Well, I don't know how to. We can't really take a vote on this at this point. I'd like to see if I could get support for option 2 of raise the EC's an eligibility to 17, under 18. I think that, in my opinion, that trumps simplicity. Yes, it's more simple to say to have it at 15, but you're going to lose a lot of people in those formative years where they might be able to make some changes and have a good experience. I would rather have it raised, and I'd like to know if there's other commissioners that feel that way. If so, then we need to let Chris know, and he can move in that direction. I believe that's the right answer.
Commissioner Sill, option 2 is less than 18. Option 3 of do nothing is less than 17 in the exact same blocks. The confusion between option 3 and option 2, or the lack of simplicity, is identical. It's just if we do nothing, we lose a year. We don't gain a year. We don't lose anything. We don't gain a year. But the complexity is identical.
I would like to gain a year. What do you think, Lauren?
I'm in support of that. It's no more complex than what we have right now.
Commissioner Ryder, I am, here's my opinion, I'm not prepared to move forward with anything at this point for deer. I would like to have another month or two to look at the other seasons. But, and I know that puts deer back a year, but that's where I'm at.
Commissioner Gfeller, if I understood the recommendation from Tana, she's saying that she's strongly recommending that either everything across the page is 16, or everything across the page is 18, or everything across the page is 17. Is that right? And that being the case, if we're forced to have an opinion today, I guess I would follow her recommendation and say, let's do everything 16. But I would like to have more information on what would we be potentially giving up in terms of licenses if we raised everything to 18 and got that extra year. If we're giving up licensing, how much is that? And that will begin to give me a little better sense of how the legislature might look at it. So I guess I'd like more information. I mean, this is a very good presentation, Jake, and I appreciate it, but I don't know if I have everything I need to figure out which direction to go here other than to simplify things.
This is Jake George. I might throw out kind of a fourth option, a little bit different than the third option of doing nothing, which at the moment we could leave the youth upland deer turkey at under the age of 17 and raise by including it in the notes with our season selection letter to the Fish and Wildlife Service, the participation in the waterfowl seasons to match that. So that gets us to under 17 across the board and would buy us some time to review both of these options that we could potentially change at a later date.
Commissioner Lauber here. As compared to doing nothing, I would propose that we do that. That would only change the waterfowl and change nothing else. We have to let the Fish and Wildlife Service know what our intention is. They now allow up to 17, and that way we would at least get that raised while we try to figure out how to maybe increase the eligibility age down the road.
Mr. Chairman, Nadia Reimer, Chief of Public Affairs. I have a constituent, Cheech, who would like to go ahead and speak, if that's all right.
Sure.
All right, Cheech, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for letting me speak. I appreciate that, Nadia. My name is Cheech Keogh, and I'm in Topeka. Earlier this year, a friend of mine and myself were ready to go down to the bottoms for youth season. We had essentially done everything we needed to do and we're packing up when we realized that his son being 17 prevented us from taking that trip. So we canceled. That was after we inquired at Fish and Wildlife about the youth season for waterfowl, because at the time it wasn't listed underneath the youth seasons for waterfowl as being 16 or younger. I believe that the youth waterfowl youth seasons across the board need to be 18 and under to give an opportunity to bring more people into the fold. We're losing hunters and we're losing participation. And part of that is things like what happened to my friend and I when we wanted to take our sons. Now I'm going to continue to go to the outdoors, and so are my boys. But it was a lost weekend, a lost opportunity. And I think that putting those young men up under the age of 18 into the field will pay dividends down the road, regardless of what you lose in short-term licensing fees. The big picture, that's where I stand, and I would encourage the commissioners to take this into consideration, because you're going to put more people in the field, and ultimately some of those people are going to continue to buy licenses down the road. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments from the commission?
So this is Commissioner Spohr. What would be the downside if we came to the conclusion that we just wanted to say 17 is the number? Is there a downfall to making that decision today? Thank you.
Well, probably not, but I think Commissioner Ryder indicated that he's not really prepared to do anything that's kind of a new subject to him and needs more information. I I would like to at least raise the waterfowl to 17 and have the, whatever it is we send the Fish and Wildlife Service, I'd like to have them be notified that we're raising it to 17. And it gets confusing when you say 17, that means under 18.
Right. This is Jake George. I would recommend, if we want to go that direction with waterfowl, that we consider doing the same with the other seasons so that they align. They may be different from the permits, but as far as opportunity and their eligibility to participate in any of the youth seasons, it should be the same. And currently we are at under the age of 17 or less than 17, so 16 for youth upland, deer, and turkey.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, it had been stated earlier that I was in favor of the 16 and under, and I'd like to clarify that I'm not pushing any decision at this point. I'm simply advocating for simplicity is all. So anything we can do, I'm not necessarily advocating for the 16 and under specifically. So Jake's just mentioned proposal there. Sounds great. It's definitely a step in the right direction. Thank you.
Yeah, and I didn't get the impression myself that you were strongly in favor, but I kind of like that idea.
Which idea?
I like the idea what Jake said of raising everything to 17 across the board.
Which is under 8, which is option 2. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Nadia Reimer, Chief of Public Affairs. Cheech had a follow-up question. He was curious what the downside was to allowing waterfowl at 18. He had understood it as being under 18.
I think the Fish and Wildlife Service has it under 18.
It's Jake George. I believe that's correct.
I think that's where the confusion, the Fish and Wildlife Service doesn't recognize the youth season unless you have it with a certain date.
Nadia Reimer, Chief of Public Affairs again. He said he was asking what the downside was to under 18.
I'm not sure there is a downside.
I guess, Commissioner Gefeller, I guess I'm confused again because I'm not sure there is either. If the definition of consistency is all the yellows are under 18 and all the greens are under 16, and if from what I understood, the reason I guess I put words in Tanner's mouth is because my understanding was if there's confusion, you lose potential hunters. And so maybe I'm not clear on what is confusing, but if option 2 is not a definition of confusing, then I would certainly lean toward option 2.
This is Jake George. I will say that's the reason that I formatted these the way that I did for the options, is because both of them have consistency. It's just whether we standardize as one across the board or we have 2 standards, one for licenses and permits and one for eligibility for participation in youth seasons.
Yeah. So again, Commissioner Gefeller, if I would lean toward option 2 because it has some simplification to it. And if that's not a confusing structure where we might lose participation, then we've solved one problem and have the potential to go all the way if we decide at a later date we want to deal with the legislature.
think you're on mute, Gerald.
Other questions from the commission? Well, I think Warren's right. I'd like to know how we go about doing this, at least to where Chris can put something in there. That doesn't require a vote today, does it?
At this point, we're just,
oh,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, Jake, George, at this point, we were looking for somewhat of a consensus so that we can begin to include that number and that language in the 25 series as they come forward to the commission for a vote.
Is there anybody who is strongly opposed to a consensus as to option 2, raise everything to 18? Does that run counter to your thoughts, Aaron?
Commissioner Ryder, I am not strongly opposed. I'm not strongly opposed to the direction that the commission would want to go. I was just looking for, and kind of like Commissioner Gefeller said, looking for more information as to, you know, numbers and what it would do potentially long term was the reason for my, you know, my reasoning for being a little hesitant. But I'm not opposed to. I'm not opposed or strongly opposed to the direction either way that the commission.
At this point, is there any commissioner who is opposed to option 2?
Commissioner Spohr, right quick, could somebody tell me how this works for non-resident youth?
I have no clue. Chris?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, our youth seasons do not delineate between residents and non-residents.
What about special permits? What about the special season permits?
Chris Tymason, again, I'm unclear what you mean by special season permits.
Okay. Commissioner Spohr, I see that. Yeah, I see now. It's not like a special permit to go hunt the refuge. It's a general youth season with dates. And it is open to all non-residents.
Chris Tymason, all of our youth seasons are open to residents and non-residents as long as they have an eligible permit, like a general deer permit or a youth permit.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Commissioner Gefeller again, just so I'm clear, I'm assuming just by giving this direction, we're not approving anything. I'm assuming we'll workshop it like we do any other issue before we vote, and during those workshops, we can gather additional information to the extent we need it before we make a decision. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Is that your understanding? Is that okay, Chris?
Mr. Chairman, Chris Tymason, this is the workshop for the deer regulations. We would be voting on the deer regulation next meeting.
This is Jake George. Just to clarify, this presentation isn't, but Levi will be covering it in the 25 series for the workshop later today. And then you guys will be voting on that in March.
I'm going to say that there is consistency, or there is a consensus.
Yeah.
And go forward with that. And well, that's what I think. And does that give you enough to go on, Chris and Jake?
Yes, that's Jake George. We can proceed accordingly.
Are we done with this subject then? Is any last thoughts by the commissioners? Okay, let's move on. Thank you, Jake. All right, the next item is Webless migratory bird regulations. Rich?
Okay, thank you, Chairman Lauber and Commissioners. This is Rich Holtice, Wildlife Research Supervisor and Migratory Game Bird Coordinator for KWPT. Joining you today to introduce the Webless Migratory Game Bird Regulation Cycle for 2021. Jason has just pulled up the corresponding briefing book item you can refer to on the screen now. As you know, regulations for doves, cranes, snipe, rails, woodcock, and crows must adhere to federal frameworks similar to the process we follow for waterfowl. Unlike waterfowl, however, stability in federal frameworks allow us to include our webless migratory game bird season regulations and limits in permanent regulation. Recent changes to our webless regulations that you may recall include splitting our sandhill crane hunting unit into west and central zones with different season dates in 2020, and changes to exotic dove regulations back in 2019. For the upcoming 2021 seasons, no changes to webless regulations are anticipated, but final staff recommendations will be presented at the March Commission meeting. A summary of the potential 2021 season dates and limits under current regulations is provided at the bottom of the webless briefing book item you can see on the screen and is included in your briefing book. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions the Commission may have.
Okay. Is there any comments from the commission? Are you done, Rich? Okay, is there any comments from the commission or the public? Well, if not, we'll move on. Tom?
Thank you, commissioners. Tom Podrowski, Migratory Game Bird Program Manager, Great Bend, Kansas. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with input from the Flyway Councils, annually develops frameworks which states are able to establish migratory game bird hunting seasons. These frameworks establish maximum bag and possession limits, season lengths, and the earliest opening and latest closing dates. States must operate within these frameworks when establishing state-specific migratory game bird seasons. A briefing item was prepared in the commission packet regarding development of Kansas's 2021-22 waterfowl seasons. Included are the proposed fish and wildlife season frameworks and pertinent background materials. There are no anticipated changes from the previous year's federal frameworks. Staff recommendations will be addressed at the March Commission meeting and would be glad to address any questions the Commission or public may have at this time.
Are there any comments or questions? You will have season recommendations at the next meeting?
Correct. We'll have the season information as well as some more background information on things like youth season, teal season, youth and veterans days, etc.
This is Commissioner Ryder. I had an email or two of some concerns with having veterans on the same weekend as the youth season, and that they some people felt that was crowding the youth out, and I didn't know if Tom had any comment on that at this point. I don't know. We're trying to open it up and give lots of people opportunities, and I don't know what the thought about that is.
So 2020 was the inaugural season, and we greatly appreciate feedback from the hunting community as we gain experience for this new season. Component of its state's season selection was based off survey results from the 2019 Waterfowl Hunter Survey, where there was strong support to hold the days simultaneously. We have received a number of passionate comments regarding the overlap, both from active military and veterans appreciative of the hunting opportunity, as well from those involved with youth hunters who feel impacted. There are some trade-off in splitting dates, such as reduction of hunting days for ducks in the high plains, as well as for light and dark goose seasons. We are examining the issue and hopefully will devise dates or season parameters that will be acceptable to all parties.
Oh, I got the same email as Aaron, and it was a good point that was made. So I think we need to think about that.
Commissioner Sill, I got several of those, and I got a phone call this week, and it was a gentleman who's dedicated his life and work to waterfowl as well as his passion. He each year tries to mentor some youth, and he spoke this year of taking a couple of youth to, I think it was Wilson, I'm not positive, but I think it was Wilson. And as they stood talking with a group of 5 hunters from Arkansas at the boat dock, they said, yeah, so-and-so's a vet, and the 4 of us just came along to hunt with him. So this youth had a less than optimal hunt because of the hunting pressure. He saw unethical behavior on the part of other hunters. It was crowded. It was not the most positive weekend. And so I think there's a couple of issues there, not just the overcrowding, but also the hesitancy to inquire as to vet status of the hunters. No disrespect to them intended, but if out of that group of 5 hunters, only 1 was a vet, that's not the only hunting group in which that happened. So I hope that as you bring things forward, that you will be able to address some of that issue as well as the competition between the two, because I share Commissioner Ryder's concerns.
However, it is illegal if you're not a veteran to be hunting during the vet season, I'm guessing. Just because you're a friend of a veteran doesn't, but I still understand. And I share the concerns that Commissioner Ryder had as well. So any other comments on this?
Commissioner Spohr, Tom, have the feds showed any signs of possibly getting some more duck days in the Central Flyway? Has there been any conversation at all about possibly getting additional days?
So the Flyways and Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service have just finalized last year the new AHM packages, and within those there's no provisions for additional hunting days. And at this time, I don't see in the near future any more additional duck hunting days, and we're already at the maximum days for goose seasons.
Okay. Any other questions for Tom?
Tom, what's your take on, Commissioner Spohr, Tom, what was your take on all the out-of-state hunters coming to Kansas this year?
So it is an increasing trend we see in the state. Around 36% last year was the number of non-resident hunters that bought our waterfowl stamp sales. There are both a lot of short-term and long-term patterns to examine, and what is too many. And from some of the hunter communications regarding this issue, we may be reaching some tolerance tipping point. But then we need to also examine the greater issue here. Is it just with non-residents? Is it a crowding issue? Is it a behavior issue? Is it public versus private land? And there are not any simple solutions. The issues are both biological and societal. And we particularly on some of our state wildlife areas or Pacific state waterfowl areas, we are seeing an increase and definitely hearing a lot from the hunting community on the issue.
This is Commissioner Spohr. Do you feel that you as the waterfowl specialist will try to come up with some regulations to help with this problem by next season?
I think there's both long-term and short-term solutions to it. There's a variety of things. Some of them are more easily implemented. Others, some will take greater regulations, things like guide services, what we can allow non-permit sales, and those impacts economically both into our federal funding as well as our state license revenues. My job is to identify these issues and develop information for the commission to make decisions to do that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Assistant Secretary Mike Miller, you had asked earlier about the sale of state duck permits, state duck stamps. If we saw an increase, and I had Doug Nygren did a little query, and if we compare those stamp sales year to date from 2019 to 2020, 2019, 35,441 state duck stamps were sold. In 2020, we sold 38,450. So just about a 4,000 increase. And that doesn't, that particular query doesn't discern between residents and non-residents. In 2018, we sold 34,380 state duck stamps.
So there is a variety of data streams we do have, not only our state waterfowl stamp sales, the small game survey, the HIP data, iSportsman, and maybe particularly at the March meeting, we can show you some of those patterns we have seen in not only in hunter participation, but also the residency of those hunters.
Okay. Be interesting to know. Let's move on to dark geese.
Gerald, this is Jason, CIO. We had a comment from the public who wanted, we have a person from the public that wanted to make a comment. Is that allowed?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, Nicholas, I will unmute you.
Thank you. Nicholas Boehm from Kansas City. I wanted to provide just a brief input on the youth veterans season. I am not a veteran, but I took a brand new waterfowl hunter on the veteran season for both the late and the southeast zone. We did our absolute best. We waited at the boat ramp basically until the last second that we could possibly go in to make sure that any youth who showed up would get the best spots and things like that. And despite that, we both agreed that just our personal feeling, even though we hunted both of the days, like I said, I didn't hunt, but he did. We both just felt that it was taking away from what the experience is supposed to be for kids, to be able to get out and hunt in a very easygoing, low-key, non-competitive situation. And we decided that we personally would not be doing it again because it just didn't quite feel right. So just wanted to share that personal experience.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, Tom, go on to geese.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Tom Bedrowski, Migratory Game Bird Program Manager, Great Bend, Kansas. KAR 115-18-13 defines dark goose species, established goose harvest management units, and hunter permit systems for those dark geese in those units, as well as providing season lengths, daily bag limits, and shooting hours in those units. These conservation measures were implemented through the 90s to address dwindling migrant stocks in eastern Kansas. However, with growing migrant stocks and the increase in resident Canada geese, dark goose management has been greatly changed from restrictive to liberal strategies. In 2008, Kansas adopted a single statewide season for dark geese. As such, there is no longer need to maintain KAR 115-18-13. It is a vestige of past goose management, and staff is recommending to revoke this regulation.
Any questions for Tom on this? That's fairly simple and straightforward. All right, thank you. Let's see, next, Jeff.
This is Jeff Prendergast, small game specialist in Hays, Kansas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. For small game and upland game bird regulations, we rarely make changes. That's because due to the biology of these species and hunter behavior that pursue them, harvest has very limited impact to the populations. So we've set our regulations to match social preference, and those stay static or relatively static over time. So normally we only address these regulations as certain specific concerns come up or we're requested to. However, given that we haven't made any real changes in these regulations in 10 years or so, we felt it was prudent to do a full review of the regulations. We recently set up a small game committee, and through this committee, we had a subcommittee that reviewed all of our small game regulations just for, again, trying to simplify, reduce, increase consistency across the regulations, and just make sure that everything's still what seemed to fit. Based on that effort, we have a few small regulation recommendations here that we're going to be working through over the next couple of meetings. I'll start with the small game regulations. This is looking at KAR 115.25-2 and KAR 115.25-3. That's the open season bag limits and possessions for rabbits and hares. This regulation in particular has remained fairly stable. The last time we made a change to this regulation was in 1993. Rabbits, despite being very abundant on the landscape and occurring statewide, receive relatively limited hunting pressure. We have this. One of the things that was noted during this review is that while we have the most liberal daily bag limit on this species compared to our other small game species, we have the most restrictive possession limit. I don't have any official recommendation at this time, but we're considering increasing the possession limit to 4 times the daily bag to make it consistent with all of our other small game and upland game bird species. In addition to this, we have a running season for rabbits, but we do not have a running season for hares. And given the nature of beagle hunters, that could potentially end up with dogs on hares. And so we're looking at including hares in the running season for rabbits as well to match those regulations. Any questions on these?
Jeff, when does a rabbit become a hare?
Got to grow up. Hares are jackrabbits.
Okay. What is our current bag daily limit on rabbits?
10 rabbits per day.
And what's our current possession limit?
3 times a daily bag.
And you're potentially considering 4 times the daily bag.
That's correct.
That's a lot of rabbits.
It is. I don't expect this to have that much of impact on the actual hunters, on the number of people that are actually going to hit that target. It's more of just trying to make the regs consistent across our other species.
Any questions for Jeff on this? If not, you guys move on to upland birds.
Okay, so first I'll be addressing KAR 115.25-1A and KAR 115.25-1B. That's the open seasons for pheasants and quail. Specifically, we're looking at the youth season. Kansas had its first upland game bird youth season in 2000. It's always been the weekend prior to the opening of the regular season. Saturday and Sunday. It includes a half daily bag limit. The initial year mentors were allowed to hunt. After that, they were not. Youth has to have a mentor, youth currently is defined as Jake, 16 and younger. And they have to have a mentor that is 18 or older with them. This season has had relatively low participation through the years, or it appears it has had relatively low participation through the years. So there's several different considerations that we're looking at in terms of what we can do to increase participation there. One of which was the age, in the potential increase of the age, which you guys are already considering. Some other things in relation to what those bag limits and mentor requirements are as well. But we don't have a recommendation at this time. I'll be bringing more information to the next meeting.
Okay. Tag team, it's Kent now.
No, I've got one more. KR 115-3-1 is game bird possession. This is we had a law enforcement individual on the regs review with us. Kansas, the last time since 1963, we've required limited that the harvest of pheasants be cocks only. In order to enforce this regulation, required that proof of sex is maintained on the bird. Currently, I forget exactly how it reads, but it's I think it says foot, plumage, or other proof of sex. And it was asked if we could remove the other to strictly clarify what it is that we consider proof of sex. The other would technically allow for the testes, which are an internal organ in birds, to be left into the rib cages. But as far as just trying to simplify and just specifically say what it is that we consider proof of sex is what we're looking at with that recommendation. So we'll be recommending to strike the language that would allow anything other than foot or plumage.
Are there any questions for Jeff on either one of these two? Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Chairman, this is Kent Fricky, Small Game Coordinator in Emporia, and I've got a quick presentation here. Wanted to give you a brief overview of our prairie chicken season in Kansas. As Jeff mentioned, the Small Game Committee underwent a regulations review in the past year, and this is one of the additional regulations that was looked at. And so as a reminder for everyone, on the left in the green hash is the overall range of greater prairie chickens in the central United States. And you'll see there are some smaller populations into Illinois, Missouri, Iowa. And in Kansas, our current season structure, we have an early season and a regular season. The early season runs each year from September 15th until October 15th. And the regular season starts the third Saturday in November and then runs to the end of January. And as Jeff mentioned, the pheasant and quail opener is on the second Saturday in November. And so this is the opener for the greater prairie chicken season is just a week later. Of special interest, I guess, to me, just as a history buff a little bit, the first season was in 1861, which is when Kansas became a state and first got our first game regulations. And we started the early season in 1989. And just for some comparison of how that stacks up against our neighboring states, in Colorado, they have a season from October 1st to January 3rd, about 3 months. And in Colorado, you have a season bag limit of 2 birds. In Oklahoma, the season was closed in 1997 due to declining populations and a very limited range within the state. And Missouri has not had an open prairie chicken prairie chicken season since 1907. In Nebraska, on the other hand, they have a very liberal season. The season opens September 1st and runs continuously through January 31st. And finally, just for comparison's sake, in South Dakota, their season is similar to Nebraska in that they have a continuous season from September 19th until January 3rd. So several, Kansas has of these states, Kansas has the only split of the early season and regular season. And because prairie grouse in general, both greater prairie chickens, which are the blue range delineation here, and sharp-tailed grouse in the pink, are such widespread species, we do have other states to look to in terms of data for both how hunting affects prairie grouse populations and how hunters are also reacting to, or hunter behavior in terms of early versus late seasons, and what harvest kind of looks like. But in Kansas, when we talk about traditional prairie chicken hunts, we often think about the Flint Hills. You see this picture from Cassidy. And historically, in the Flint Hills especially, the prairie chicken hunts were a really, really big deal to local communities, lots of hunter breakfasts, and lots of people looking forward to the opener of the regular season in the Flint Hills. But beyond that, when we look in general in Western states for both greater prairie chickens and sharp-tailed grouse, there's more of a tradition of trying to get an earlier season and a lot of participation in that early season, primarily by bird hunters who like to utilize dogs a little bit more when birds are less likely to flush out of range, are a lot of young of the year birds that hold a little tighter and are a little more naive. And so we've had this greater interest, obviously with the inaction of the early season in 1989, and more interest has been geared toward that early season as kind of a first opportunity for bird hunters to get dogs out. And from our small game harvest survey, we're able to track the number of days hunted, where hunters are actually targeting greater prairie chickens, which is the top blue hashed line here, and also the estimated harvest, which is the bottom orange line. And you can see that certainly in comparison to the late 70s and up to the mid 1980s, there's really not many hunters partaking and specifically targeting greater prairie chickens in the state. And in the last 10 years, we've had a relatively stable, both relatively low number of hunter days in terms of effort, and also a relatively low harvest of prairie chickens in the state. Beginning in 2012, we've begun to augment this information with Kansas Prairie Chicken Hunter Activity Survey, where when we of course, we require a prairie chicken stamp for any hunters targeting prairie chickens. And through that, we're able to then ask people who purchase that stamp about their activities. And so in the blue, you see the number of prairie chickens the estimated number of prairie chickens that are harvested in both blue, the early season, and in orange in the regular season. And you'll see that it's beginning to equate somewhat in terms of, while the early season is only 1 month long and the late season is roughly 2.5 months long, roughly half of our prairie chickens are harvested in that early season. Furthermore, we're able to ask hunters where they are targeting most of their efforts. And since we began collecting data in 2012, you see that there's a few counties in the eastern portion of the state, primarily Butler and Greenwood, that have dropped off of the kind of top counties where people are focusing efforts. However, you see that many of the counties in this, especially Smoky Hills, north central portion of the state, are maintaining that status of being targeted by prairie chicken hunters. And there's likely a number of interacting reasons for this, one of which may be access. In the Flint Hills, especially, there's relatively low numbers of acreages of weehaw, and very few number statewide in terms of public land area, public wildlife areas that even have prairie chickens on them. And so in general, I think that there's a lot more access, and we may be seeing, more of a just lack of, we're just seeing that drop of tradition in the Flint Hills in the eastern portion of the state. And from that hunter harvest survey, various comments that we get, in general, we get a lot of comments that hunters enjoy the early season. However, they also say that they are looking for more mixed bag opportunities. And so this specifically addresses where the regular season starts a week later than the pheasant and quail opener. Lots of people that purchase a prairie chicken stamp would like the ability to, and they may be focusing more of their effort that opening weekend of pheasant and quail opener. They would just like the opportunity to harvest a prairie chicken if they come across one. And so we do get quite a few comments like that. But I will say in general, of course, we do have decent population trend data across the state as well. And so on the screen here on the map is in purple is the Greater Prairie Chicken Range in Kansas. And as well as the blocked areas are our small game regions, which we use to summarize data. And for 3 of those that we have the most consistent and lengthy data, the Flint Hills are highlighted in red, or the line in red. The Osage Cuestas in the southeastern portion of the state are in blue. And the green is the Smoky Hills in the north central part of the state. And so this is summarized data from LEC surveys that our biologists do each spring. And you can see that in general, we have a slightly declining population in the Flint Hills. And again, I'm making pretty general statements here. A relatively stable population in the Smoky Hills, and very much a declining population in the far southeastern portion of the state in the Osage Cuestas. We don't have many routes up in the glaciated plains in the northeastern portion of the state, but trends are pretty similar there in terms of number of prairie chickens as well. And so I wanted to present this just because, again, we do have this biological data in terms of abundance of birds on the landscape. But that said, even with some slightly declining populations overall, with the exception of the southeastern portion of the state, or the extreme eastern portion of the state, we found that, or research has shown that harvest is not likely to be additive, especially in Kansas where we have relatively few hunters harvesting relatively few birds. Some research on lesser prairie chickens has shown that harvest levels of about 3% in lesser prairie chickens before their season was closed did not affect the population in the southwestern portion of the state. And so we think that likely holds true for greater prairie chickens as well. Again, in places like the Flint Hills, there's relatively low hunter access. In the Smoky Hills, you do get more, but in general, there's relatively low access to these large chunks of grassland and ranches that that hold some of our bigger populations of greater prairie chickens. And finally, and this applies certainly statewide, but where we have seen those declines in populations, in no way does it look like harvest is driving that. It's very much due to habitat loss and alteration and not harvest. And so, again, we think that that overall, the big point here is that harvest is not likely currently or in the future to have a big additive interaction with our populations. And so to summarize, currently we have the early season and regular season starting on the 3rd Saturday in November, and we're exploring these as the following options. Of course, always the potential for no change. We're exploring the potential opportunity to adjust the regular season start date to the second Saturday in November to coincide with the pheasant and quail opener. And then finally, we're exploring the option of just creating a full one season, starting on September 15th and then running through as we have through January 31st. And with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Are there any questions for Kent?
Kent, what's the Commissioner Spore? Kent, what's the limit on prairie chickens per day?
2 per day.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Feller, with respect to number 2, opening with pheasant and quail, do you have any concern about mistaken pheasant hen kills if people are able to shoot prairie chicken?
Yeah, no, I do not. Up until this point, there's been no, we did discuss this with the small game committee, which as Jeff mentioned, we have a law enforcement officer on. Even during the regular early season, or no, sorry, not the regular, the early season from September to October, we haven't had any reported instances of that being an issue even in that season. And so we do not anticipate or have any real concerns with that being the case if that were overlaid. We've also, in other states, for example, Nebraska, that have that continuous season as well, we haven't seen any big issues in those states either.
Okay. And then second question, Commissioner Feller again. The original idea of the split season, what was the rationale?
If I was told correctly, which I'm sure I was, it was, again, we had a later start date. I believe at that time, it was the week in 1989 and before, I believe it was the week before pheasant and quail opener. So the first Saturday in November. And at that time, I think that people looked northward and westward and saw other states looking at having those earlier seasons, being able to run bird dogs, having that opportunity to hunt upland birds, specifically prairie chickens and grouse in other states, and wanted to see that opportunity in Kansas.
Right, but they could have had a continuous single season without the split. So was there any reason for that split?
Correct. I think the primary reason for that split was still to maintain that tradition, that traditional hunt of having an opener for the regular season. Again, especially in the Flint Hills, where at that time you saw more hunters congregating, doing more, early morning pass shooting as opposed to pursuing on foot with dogs. Not that all the hunting was like that, but you just saw more of a tradition associated with the opener of the prairie chicken season.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Kent, this is Emmerich Cross. When did that early season start again? What year was that? How long ago?
1989.
89. Okay, thank you.
Any more questions for Kent?
This is Commissioner Spore. Option number 3 sure seems to be the simplest if we're wanting to move towards being simpler. Option 3 makes some sense to me.
Thank you. And one thing I will present at the next meeting with our recommendation will be additional information from this year's prairie chicken hunter activity survey. I didn't want to present too much here because we'll have new data in another month here. And so I will present some additional information from that survey where we've been asked, where we first asked last year, and we'll again being asking this year, hunters' thoughts on a potential expansion.
Okay. Any other comments on this subject for Kent? Well, let's move on.
Commissioner Lauber, I have a public comment from Larry Scott, if you're okay with it.
Yes, certainly.
Okay, I'm gonna unmute you, Larry.
Thank you for listening to me. I live about a mile west, a mile north of Allen, Kansas, if you know where that is, about 20 miles north of Emporia. I share a lot of the concerns that were discussed early in the meeting with regard to outfitters. Have commented on those from time to time. My biggest concern and my reason for attending this meeting is with regard to prairie chicken populations in the Flint Hills. I started hunting prairie chicken in 1965 when I was a student at Kansas State. My cousin owned the place where I live now. Yeah, Kent is correct. In 1965, there were groups. Opening weekend of prairie chicken season was a big deal. Basically, people were hunting all around the area. You would hear people shoot to the northwest, and then maybe they would shoot to the west, and then here comes the chickens. We would shoot in the field I was hunting in. Chickens move on over to the next field east, and they would shoot over there, etc. I moved here in 2004. Snowstorm in January, a little 1 acre bean field south of my house. I counted 163 chickens in that field. My count might be plus or minus 5 birds, but it's not far off. Last winter, similar circumstances, January snowstorm, I counted 35 birds. This fall, before the season opened, I had 1 bird coming into a couple of fields. I did not see that bird every day, but I walked by the fields on a daily basis, saw that bird 5 or 6 times. That was absolutely the only bird that I saw prior to the opening day of the late season, the November season. What's causing the problem? I wish I knew, but the decline has corresponded to that early season. I wish I had a reference for you. I unfortunately don't have a reference, but I read a paper that consisted of talking about killing birds on the let in the early season, kill off a lot of the dominant male birds. People who hunt at early season know where the lets are. I am very concerned about early season hunting and prairie chicken. I think that has a disruptive effect on the social structure of the bird. So I will write comments and send to somebody later based on your earlier discussions. I also have a lot of concerns about use of walk-in hunting area as well as outfitters, but those are kind of secondary to my concerns about the prairie chicken population, at least in the Flint Hills. I don't know much about hunting prairie chicken in other areas. I grew up in Washington County. It's kind of a fringe area. Have killed a chicken or two in Washington County, but that's fairly rare. So thanks for my comments. And like I say, I'm just very concerned about the number of chickens that we have.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Well, let's move on. Kent?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll share my screen here again. I wanted to take the opportunity today to present some research that we have been working on with Wichita State and Emporia State. If I can get this going. There we go. That looks specifically at the effects of cattle grazing on CRP. And this will be hopefully a brief overview of the project and some initial findings, but really wanted to highlight some of the research that we've got ongoing and how we're trying to design research to specifically inform our policy and management decisions, not only within just the department, but with our conservation partners across the state. And so certainly want to recognize Bill Jensen, Greg Hausman, and Mary Liz Jameson and Molly Reichenborn. These are researchers from Wichita State and Emporia State Universities who have collaborated with us on this project. And so, of course, one of the primary issues that we deal with as a wildlife agency and conservation-minded people is habitat loss and fragmentation. In the figure here in the gold color are the ag fields in Kansas. And you can see that they're quite extensive. And when you start looking at intact grasslands, aside from the Flint Hills and the Red Hills in the Southwest, we really lack a lot of grassland in the state. And so this is a primary concern on a number of levels, and certainly something that Jeff and I deal with daily in terms of helping manage the upland bird species. But CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, is a program that allows us to, in many ways, combat some of this loss and fragmentation of grassland. And of course, as most are familiar in this meeting, the CRP began in the mid-1980s as a program that was meant to take marginal cropland out of production and put it more towards soil and wind erosion, address some of those issues. But over time, that has also adapted to where wildlife is a chief concern that's being addressed with CRP fields across the country and certainly in Kansas. And specifically in Kansas, we have nearly 2 million acres of CRP across the state. And as we all know, it's very important to wildlife resources that we manage. Just as a brief example, through research that we've done with Kansas State University, we found how important to lesser prairie chickens CRP is, especially during periods of drought, when of course upland bird species are most susceptible. CRP helps to keep prairie chickens on the landscape. And as Jeff mentioned last meeting in his cover crop presentation, we found that over 50% of pheasant hens are nesting in CRP. And that's important when we work in conjunction and try to target conservation for both CRP targeting and those cover crop areas as well. Furthermore, in terms of the hunting resource and hunters in the state, approximately 30% or 350,000 acres of our walk-in hunting access program has CRP on it. And so obviously that's extremely important for our upland bird hunters, our deer hunters, of having those opportunities because it's so important to our game species and other wildlife species. And of course, it's of economic importance to landowners. One, they may be able to take marginal cropland that they're not making a profit on out of production, but certainly the benefit of having those properties for emergency haying and grazing is also a bit of a lifeline during years of drought where landowners are struggling. And so in general, the department has three primary goals that we have when discussing and trying to help inform policy decisions about CRP. First, of course, is to maximize the quantity. So maximize acreage within the state throughout the Great Plains as much as we can. Some grass is better than no grass. And of course, then on those properties that are enrolled, we want to maximize habitat quality. Looking for opportunities to change from, you know, what we may often think of as CRP fields, from kind of monotypic single species stands of grass to something more diverse and something that'll sustain more, have more opportunities for wildlife. And finally, ensure longevity. And by this, I mean, if you have a 10 or 15 year contract, we want to look for opportunities to keep that CRP in grass beyond that single enrollment, whether that means re-enrollment, or if that property is taken out of enrollment in CRP, are there opportunities to help us incentivize those landowners to keep it in grass after that, rather than plowing it up and turning it back into cropland. And so with this specific project, we've tried to address some of those goals. And of course, specifically for habitat quality, everyone's probably familiar with CRP mid-contract management, which is required of landowners that enrolled in CRP to do some kind of disturbance to the property within their CRP contract. That might be disking and interseeding forbs. It might be some limited haying and grazing. It might be prescribed fire, another number of other alternatives. But one of the things that's been really restricted in the past is the grazing component, typically only for emergency grazing opportunities. But as I mentioned before, we often see stands where, similar to the left, you see just more monotypic, real heavy grass cover, where in a lot of ways, in terms to benefit wildlife, we'd like to see more of what's on the right, where you have more plant diversity and increased habitat structure on those things. And so again, with the idea that, and one of the limitations that we have in more of a single species research approach, whether it be prairie chickens or pheasant or quail or any other species, is that by only looking at one species, while it may be of high interest to the department and our hunters, those often don't address the issues that federal agencies like the Farm Service Agency, the FSA, and NRCS want to see to inform their discussions and policy decisions. And so this effort is really a way to try and look at an entire ecosystem by making a single management action. And so this is a conceptual model that the researchers came up with of how we could address this and better inform these decisions. And so on the left, you see how plant community diversity and structure have the potential to impact this whole trophic interaction, to where plants support the food, which includes obviously certainly insects, and taking that all the way down the line to birds, which of course feed on those things and use that plant community for the habitat that they rely on in their different life stages. And so to look at this a little bit simpler, we can kind of think about looking at plant diversity and structure as being kind of a proxy for the habitat status and what the ability to support wildlife is. Of course, the flowering plants specifically within that plant diversity impact pollinators and other invertebrates, ground beetles, important food resources for our wildlife, and specifically birds. And as I mentioned, birds, and especially here, you can think about turkey poults, pheasant and quail chicks, really require those invertebrates for the protein that they need to grow after they hatch. And then finally, all that together, both the plants and invertebrates, affect the bird habitat that's out there for as I mentioned, the different life stages of birds. When we look at Kansas and its as the entire state, we see that there's a lot of diversity in habitat types across the state. And so to make this fairly simplistic, we've got shortgrass prairie in the west, mixed grass prairie in the central, and tallgrass prairie in the east. And it really sets us up for a nice opportunity to do a statewide study to look at, again, a single management option. And this is, of course, is highlighted in the precipitation gradient across the state as well. where you might have less than 14 inches of rain annually in the southwest portion of the state, and upwards of 40 inches in the extreme southeast portion of the state. And so the researchers in 2016 began a research project to look at sampling CRP fields across the state to specifically look at grazing as an opportunity, basically for expanded use as a mid-contract management tool. And so what you see here highlighted are the different regions of the state, and the dots are the different CRP fields across the state that where landowners agreed to allow us access to their properties. So half were grazed and half were not. So about 54 were grazed, 54 were not. We had 108 total sites. I guess I didn't mention that, which in terms of an ecological study is a lot of sites, and we're covering a lot of ground in this study, which was done from we did field work in 2016 all the way through 2019. And so from that research, we're just now finishing up this study, we had 5 different master's students go through both Wichita State and Emporia State universities. And I mean, we probably got upwards of 1,000 pages in these documents that are being looked at. And those researchers and students are continuing to put out publications to scientific peer-reviewed journals. And so it's really neat. And of course, this project we got this started just as I was coming on to the department in 2016. And so it's been really neat to see these young researchers work through the process and work through the data and get us the information for this. In addition to these 5 master's students that have now graduated, the 2 universities employed over 50 undergraduate technicians to work on these projects in both the summer, in the field, and lab work the rest of the year. And so a very brief summary of the study, of the findings. First, overall, one that I wanted to highlight was number 2 there, where moderate grazing over 2 years did not lead to the degradation of the plant community. And this is important because obviously there's always going to be concerns about whether or not cattle grazing has a detrimental effect. We did use a pretty moderate grazing scheme for this, but at the same time we also wanted to address this as a mid-contract management option, where we didn't feel that it was likely that a more extreme, heavier grazing regime would be acceptable to our federal partners. In terms of insect response really depended on the region of the state that you were in. And this is the real benefit of doing a statewide study, is that we can identify portions of the state where, for example, in the mixed grass, if insect responses were very good, then we can focus on that and keep that as an option there. But if responses were lower in, say, the southwestern portion of the state, then we can adjust our policy recommendations accordingly. And finally, the bird aspect of things, again, we're looking at songbirds in this case. We looked at abundance and diversity of birds using CRP fields, and as well as nesting of these species. Even as far as getting blood samples from newly hatched chicks and doing triglycerides, getting triglyceride samples from these chicks. Overall, no impact on, or had varying impacts on the different species, which you would expect with a community study. And there were some indirect risks to bird nests. As with any of our upland bird species, of course, depredation is always a concern with other species as well when you're talking about ground nesting birds. And then if anybody's familiar with brown-headed cowbirds, which are a nest parasite, they don't actually have their own nest, but I don't know if you can see in the bottom right corner there, the speckled egg there is a cowbird egg, which basically just a nest parasite. And then cattle, similar to many other studies, cattle destroyed very few nests. 4 nests were destroyed by cattle trampling out of over 2,000 nests that were found during the study. And so, of course, no big impact there. And so overall, things are looking really good. I'm really excited about the potential of this. We're working with our federal partners, specifically FSA and NRCS. Other people that have had input on this study include the Nature Conservancy, Playa Lakes Joint Venture, and others. And the conversation continues, but point being that we receive the real benefits of designing research in a way that has the potential to better inform our decisions. And so our state offices can take those discussions to, and now data, to Washington. The researchers on this study actually just did a presentation, over an hour-long presentation with decision makers in Washington for FSA to specifically talk about grazing, the potential for increasing grazing opportunities on CRP in the future. So certainly want to thank our partners. And finally, I'm sure we've got some landowners still on the webinar here. As you can imagine, the researchers had to call many more than 108 landowners, but to get 108 landowners to give access to their property to do this type of a study across the state is really commendable to the landowners and their ability to, and willingness to allow us access and use their properties to do this research. So, and certainly I don't want to also understate the potential impact on economic benefits for landowners as well. If we can increase some grazing on CRP, one, I think that improves wildlife habitat, which is important to us as a department, but the more ability farmers and ranchers have to keep cattle on the landscape in a good way for wildlife, I think that gets us more grass into the future and provides us more habitat in the future. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Anybody have any questions for Kent? Well, that was a good report.
Thank you.
Well, having no questions, Linda? You want to talk about kiosks?
I will. Linda Lanchman from Pratt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. Pretty simple today. I'm looking at KAR 115-9-6. It's vehicle permit display. Currently, all of our permits are, you have to be attached or affixed to the front windshield. We are getting ready to install 26 electronic kiosk systems. And those systems will be credit card only, and it will spit out a permit that we will have just to lay on the dash to where it can be visibly seen through the front windshield. And Jason was going to put up a picture of what one looks like. We're pretty excited about this. It will integrate into our reservation system and get cash out of the field. So other state park systems have these and have noticed an increase in revenue based on these machines, especially in locations where it's hard to staff as often as we could normally. And it makes people more willing to pay when there's a location to pay. So with that, if there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Linda, is this for annual fees, annual permits, as well as day permits?
It's mainly day use only. The annual permit is an actual, haven't decided exactly that, but I think right now we're going to go with day use permits only.
Okay.
Commissioner Spohr, Linda, what's the deal structure? Are you owning the machines, renting them, partnering?
Linda Landman, thank you, Troy, for that question. We will own them. It was part of our contract with our reservation company.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other for Linda?
Commissioner Sill, is there the potential then to go to including the annuals at some point?
Linda Landman and Pratt, Commissioner Sill, absolutely, it can be done.
I know that once in a while, when you can't find somebody you go a really long time before you can actually find somebody to buy one of those from. And it's a little awkward kind of being out there, but not having one and not having an option to buy one either.
Linda Lanterman, Commissioner Seal, good point. What we would do is they would have to come in and replace that in the park office at some point, because it's more of a just a receipt type.
Okay.
I'd like to see it go that way at some point to include those.
We have a hand up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, David Condos with the Kansas News Service. I had a question for Director Lanterman. What do you know when you expect these kiosks to be installed? When would they start working?
We hope to get them, Linda Lanterman out of Pratt. Thank you for that question. We hope to get those started this summer. We'll get 26. There will be one in every state park that has a campground, and a couple of state parks will have 2. They will run off electricity or solar and cellular data or our internet service.
Okay. And one more question, if I may. I know you mentioned that some other state park systems have implemented this, and they've seen increased revenues, especially for areas where somebody might not be able to find a ranger or a more remote area. Do you have any estimates as far as like what the revenue would be like for per machine, or like any expectations for how this will increase a revenue at a certain site?
Linda Lanterman out of Pratt. That's a great question, David. I do not. Last year was such a different year for us. It's hard to believe that we can continue go up, but I do expect some increases. State park systems like Wisconsin, Oregon, Colorado use these systems. They're in the Forest Service, as you can see here, and the National Park Service. It will just depend on location, but I certainly expect some increases because they will have to buy it. It will be just like Commissioner Sill said, there'll be something there for them to buy.
Thank you. And sorry, one last quick one. Are these going to be placed at the entrance or at the campground or somewhere else?
Linda Lanterman and Pratt. Thank you again, David. Most of them will be at the entrance. There'll be some that we don't, because the reason why is because it's close to internet service and electricity. We might have to be strategic on some to where they'd be used more often. So that hasn't been determined yet.
Okay. Thank you for your time, Director.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Let's move into the workshop session. Matt Peak.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'll be Matt Peak, Emporia Research and Survey Office. I'll be presenting KAR 115.25.7, Antelope Open Season Bag Limit and Permits. We're not proposing any change to the season structure, permit type, or season dates with this regulation at this time. We are still trying to get the Southern Aerial Survey, the Southern Unit Aerial Survey routes completed, after which time we'll have permit recommendations for you. We're anticipating a decrease in permit allocations. And at the last meeting, I believe I brought up a little bit of a concern about archery harvest pressure that the herd has faced the last couple of years. And to give you just a brief idea of where we're at, before 2005, we never sold more than 150 permits. But since 2009 to present, we've never sold less than 250 permits. So that was below 150 pre-2005 and over 250 since that time. This current season, we sold 402 permits, which is the most we've ever sold, and it surpassed the previous high of 380 in 2012. And then it also surpassed the last 5-year average by almost 100. So we somewhat of an anomaly, but the permit sales have been going up for a period of time. And associated with that, our harvest has also increased to 83 this year, which is the most archery hunters have ever killed. And this is somewhat preliminary. The harvest analysis is preliminary at this point. So that could change by a few animals, but is not likely to change very much. But our 5-year average is in the mid 50s. And so this year's harvest was almost 50% over the previous average. And then just for comparison, so this year archery hunters killed 83, firearm hunters killed 118, and it takes 5 or 6 years to get one of those permits. And muzzleloader hunters killed just 24. So the point is, archery hunters are now harvesting a significant percent of the total of pronghorn that are being taken. I would also note that with that high harvest pressure by archery hunters comes a decrease in satisfaction that we detected a little bit this year. There's more pressure in the areas that archery hunters are going to from out of the area. And so I think that's the reason we're seeing somewhat of a decline. But anyway, that's an issue we're looking into, and I'll leave it at that for now. So I'll turn this back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Matt. Does anybody have any questions for Matt? Do you think the unlimited archery permits may be a thing of the past?
Well, that's something we need to talk about. I mean, we could put a limit on them of something like 300, and most people would still get to hunt. And if pressure dropped back off, then it would essentially be unlimited again. But we have not broadly discussed those things, and so there are some other data we need to look at to make a determination as to whether that's going to be necessary.
Okay. Any other?
Commissioner Spohr, Matt, what's the split between non-resident and resident archery?
We only sell 9 non-resident over the counter. We only sold 9 non-resident over the counter archery permits this year. So this is almost exclusively, and then 393 resident over the counter permits. So yeah, non-residents are insignificant relative to harvest and pressure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any more questions for Matt? Well, Matt, go on to elk.
Okay, KAR 115.25.8 elk open season bag limit and permits. Again, we're not proposing any change to this regulation relative to season structure, permit type, season dates. All standard as it has been for several years. I can provide you with a brief season update. We've sold 150 permits as of today, and our previous high was last year at 153. And so we're likely to surpass that again this year. I don't have any type of summary of harvest off of Fort Riley, but the Fort Riley season itself has closed. And so I do have information that Fort Riley provided from those hunters, and 9 of the 12 any elk hunters harvested bulls. Actually, maybe there was 13, 9 of 13, I think, harvested bulls. And 10 of the 18 antlerless elk permit holders were successful on Fort Riley. And of course, both of the unsuccessful of both of those could still be hunting off post, but that's just where the success rates on post. And so this was another, successful season with high success rates on Fort Riley. Again, even though it is a difficult hunt, a lot of people who work pretty hard at it, and most of them are successful. We do have permit allocations to propose at this time. I visited with Fort Riley staff after the briefing book came out, so the briefing book doesn't reflect this, but we will stick with the same permit allocations. Our recommendation will be to issue the same permit numbers on Fort Riley as we have the last couple of years, and that would be 12 any elk permits and 18 antlerless elk permits. And of course, those antlerless elk permits are valid during 1 month of the season with a firearm anyway. So with that, I'll turn this back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any questions for Matt from the commission? Well, hearing no questions, I think that concludes our afternoon session. I'm going to recess the meeting and we will reconvene at 6:30. We'll see you all then.